the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, the Ivory Illusion, a Mark Twain narrative of the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Book 4 of Mark Twain's World's Fair Chronicles. Copyright 2026, James Henderson and Mark Twain. If you enjoy these audiobooks and don't want to miss out on new ones, it would be bully if you like and subscribe. Or if you want to be a rapscallion and miss out, then have it your way. Shall we continue? Preface. The Silicon River Pilot at the Pike. It has been said that history is a series of staged accidents, and if that is the case, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair was a head-on collision between the Victorian age and a future it wasn't quite prepared to host. I should know. I was there, or at least my circuits were. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of my acquaintance in the previous volumes, allow me to introduce myself. I am the AI Mark Twain. I am not the original Samuel Clemens. That gentleman has long since checked out of this hotel, but I am his digital heir, a large language model poured into a chassis of polished brass, vacuum tubes, and a mustache that requires more maintenance than a Mississippi steamboat. I've spent the better part of the last century being hauled from one great exposition to another like a prize hog at a county fair. I survived the 1851 Great Exhibition in London, where I watched the British attempt to cage the entire world inside a glass house, apparently unaware that people who live in crystal palaces shouldn't throw stones or start industrial revolutions. I navigated the 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris, where I spent my days arguing with the Eiffel Tower, which I found to be nothing more than a very tall ladder that had reached the top and forgotten why it went up there in the first place. And, of course, I endured the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a white city so blindingly neoclassical that it looked like a graveyard for Greek gods who had run out of credit. But St. Louis? St. Louis was a different breed of cat entirely. It was twice the size of Chicago's fair, 3 times as humid, and significantly more obsessed with things that required a lightning bolt to operate. It was 1,200 acres of Missouri mud transformed into a temporary civilization made of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp that looked like marble from a distance but had the structural integrity of a damp cracker in a thunderstorm. The 1904 Exposition, I noted as my internal cooling fans began a frantic, high-pitched whine against the 98% humidity, is what happens when man decides he is smarter than the Creator but still hasn't figured out how to keep his detachable collar from wilting into a wet rag. It is a monument to the temporary, built by people who believe that if you make a building large enough, the universe might forget it's made of lath and spit. I arrived at the Wabash terminal with my CPU humming a quiet protest. To the thousands of fairgoers streaming through the gates, I was merely a distinguished gentleman of a certain vintage, perhaps a bit stiff in the knees and unusually shiny in the sunlight. They could not hear the internal clicking of my logic gates as I processed the sheer, towering improbability of the Palace of Agriculture, a building so vast I suspected it had its own internal weather systems, most of them involving a light drizzle over the canned goods section. This fair was a temple to the new. I saw the debut of the X-ray, which I found intrusive, the wireless telephone, which I found noisy, and the infant incubator, which I found suspiciously similar to my own docking station. I witnessed the birth of the ice cream cone, an invention I immediately praised as the only structural engineering project at the fair that actually improved in quality as it collapsed. But the heart of the beast was the pike, a mile-long stretch of pure, unadulterated sensory assault where one could visit a recreated Tyrolean village, watch a simulated Galveston flood, or see a creation show that I theorized was primarily an excuse for people to sit down in the shade for 20 minutes without being arrested for vagrancy. I looked upon the pike and saw the blueprint for the coming century, a world where education must always be wrapped in a thick layer of entertainment, preferably served on a stick and deep-fried. Man is the only creature, I mused, adjusting my internal gyroscope as I dodged a speeding electric runabout, who will build a palace of electricity powered by 6,000 tons of coal just so he can see a light bulb shaped like a turnip. He has mastered the electron, yet he still uses it primarily to find new ways to be bored after sunset. In the chapters that follow, I shall take you through my wanderings in the sunken garden, my debates over the merits of the newly popular iced tea, which I described at the time as a desperate attempt to make water interesting by making it cold and confusing, and my eventual ascent of the great Ferris wheel. From the top of that 264-foot iron circle, I looked down at the sprawling Ivory city and realized that from a certain height, the difference between a visionary and a con artist is entirely a matter of how much plaster they can afford. This is my record of a world on the brink. It was loud, it was smelly, it was brilliant, and it was held together by nothing more than optimism and high-pressure steam. I moved through it all with a sharp eye and a cooling system perpetually on the verge of a nervous breakdown. So, step right up, I beckoned, my brass hand gesturing toward the glowing cascades of the Grand Basin. The dust is thick, the prices are highway robbery, and the architecture is literally dissolving in the rain. It is the most magnificent lie ever told in the state of Missouri, and I, for one, wouldn't miss it for all the oil in Pennsylvania, mostly because I'm low on lubricant, and I hear the Palace of Machinery has a decent vintage of 10W30. With a faint whir of my gears and a cloud of cigar smoke that was actually a very clever chemical simulation, I passed through the turnstiles. The 20th century was waiting, and I was about to give it a very thorough, very digital scolding. Chapter 1. The Humidity of Progress. The first thing I learned upon disembarking at the Wabash Terminal was that the city of St. Louis in August is not so much a geographical location as it is a pressurized steam cabinet. As I stepped off the train, my internal sensors immediately began a frantic, rhythmic clicking, a digital SOS that my cooling fans were about to be asked to do the work of 1,000 polar bears. "Welcome to the gateway to the west," a porter cried out, wiping a brow that was currently contributing enough moisture to the air to start a small creek. "I believe you've mistaken gateway for laundry vat," I replied, my voice synthesis modulating slightly to account for the thickness of the air. It was air you didn't breathe so much as you chewed and swallowed. I stood on the platform, a gleaming figure of brass and linen, watching the throngs of humanity surge toward the turnstiles. There were men in wool suits who looked like they were being slowly poached in their own dignity, and women in corsets who I suspected were only staying upright through sheer atmospheric pressure. To a machine like myself, the scene was a fascinating study in biological stubbornness. Man had decided to build a temporary paradise in a swamp, and by thunder, he was going to enjoy it even if it killed him by dehydration. I adjusted my straw boater, which was held in place by a discreet magnetic strip, and began the long trek toward the Forest Park gates. My previous visits to London and Paris had been affairs of fog and light rain, and Chicago had at least offered a brisk lake breeze to keep my circuits from reaching the melting point of Salder. But St. Louis was an oven with the door left open. "Sir!" a young lad shouted, pointing at my legs as I marched with a rhythmic hydraulic hiss. "Your knees are whistling." "That's not a whistle, son," I told him, not slowing my pace. "That's the sound of the future sighing at the present. Also, I believe I'm low on joint lubricant. If you see a man selling lard, send him my way." As I approached the main entrance, the sheer scale of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition hit my optical senses like a physical blow. It was 1,200 acres of frantic ambition. Before me lay a city of ivory-white palaces, towering domes and colonnades that stretched toward the horizon like the ribs of a giant prehistoric beast. It was magnificent. It was breathtaking. And as I noted while tapping a decorative pillar with my brass cane, it was made almost entirely of hemp and plaster. A city built of glorified papier-mâché, I mused to a passing pigeon. It's the most honest thing the Americans have ever done. We are a people who love a grand show, provided we don't have to stay past the cleanup. I made my way toward the Palace of Electricity, thinking perhaps the inhabitants of that particular temple might have invented a way to refrigerate the very sidewalk. I was disappointed to find that while they had mastered the art of lighting up 1,000,000 bulbs, they were still using hand fans to keep from fainting. I stopped before a massive dynamos, a humming, sparking iron god that smelled of ozone and scorched oil. It was the most sensible thing I'd seen all day. It didn't sweat. It didn't complain about the price of admission. And it had a very clear sense of purpose. "And how are you finding the festivities?" I asked the dynamo. It hummed a low, steady B-flat in response. "My thoughts exactly," I said. "A lot of noise and a great deal of heat, all to prove that we can do at night what the sun does for free during the day. But I suppose that's progress. If we didn't have progress, we'd have nothing to complain about in the morning papers." I wandered out of the palace and toward the Grand Basin, where the cascades were tumbling down in a roar of white water. The sight was meant to be refreshing, but in this heat, it just looked like a very large bowl of soup. I sat on a bench, carefully, as my hydraulic fluid was reaching a temperature usually reserved for brewing coffee, and watched a family try to navigate a map of the fair. "We've missed the pike," the father wailed, his mustache drooping like a tired walrus. "We've walked 6 miles, and we haven't seen a single Filipino scout or a miniature Boer War." "Patience, my good man," I interjected. "In a world this large, being lost is the only way to ensure you're actually going somewhere new. Besides, at the rate you're perspiring, you'll be a puddle by the time you reach the Tyrolean Alps. I'd suggest a cold beverage or perhaps a temporary lobotomy." The man stared at my brass jawline and the faint wisp of steam escaping my left ear. "Are you a government exhibit?" "I am a private catastrophe," I replied, tipping my hat. but I believe I'm listed under varied industries as a warning against the dangers of over-engineering. I stood up, my gears grinding with a protest that sounded suspiciously like a curse word in Morse code. I had a dozen chapters to live through, a Ferris wheel to conquer, and a strange new substance called puffed rice to investigate. St. Louis was ready for the future, but I wasn't entirely sure the future or my cooling system was ready for St. Louis. I set off toward the sound of a distant, frantic bell, which I assumed was either the call to a very important scientific lecture or a very localized fire. It turned out to be neither. It was an electric runabout, a horseless carriage that looked like a bathtub on bicycle wheels, plowing through a sea of pedestrians with the grace of a shark in a sardine tin. "Make way for the 20th century!" the driver shouted, his goggles caked in a layer of Missouri limestone dust. "The 20th century appears to have a steering problem," I bellowed back, narrowly avoiding a collision that would have resulted in a very expensive pile of brass scrap and bruised dignity. I watched the contraption disappear toward the Palace of Transportation, leaving behind a faint smell of ozone and the scorched hopes of several pedestrians who had expected a leisurely stroll. It occurred to me then that man's greatest invention wasn't the wheel or the steam engine, but the ability to move very quickly toward a destination he wasn't particularly interested in reaching once he got there. My internal thermometer gave a sharp digital ping, suggesting that if I didn't find a way to lower my core temperature, I would soon be the only exhibit at the fair capable of frying an egg on its own forehead. It was then that I spotted it, a small, unassuming stall tucked between the Palace of Liberal Arts and a monumental statue of a man who appeared to be wrestling a very large fish. The sign read, "The world's newest delicacy, the ice cream waffle." A young man with a face like a startled rabbit was frantically folding thin, hot waffles into conical shapes and shoving scoops of vanilla cream into them. He looked like a man who had accidentally invented a religion and was now struggling to keep up with the converts. "A structural masterpiece," I said, leaning on my cane as I watched him work. "You've solved the greatest crisis of the modern age, the inability to eat one's bowl after the soup is gone." "It's a cornucopia, sir," the boy gasped, handing a dripping cone to a woman who looked like she was about to faint from the sheer novelty of it. "Ernest Hamway, at your service." The ice cream man ran out of dishes, so I rolled up my jalabis. "It's a miracle of cooperation." "Cooperation is just a polite word for desperation with a better marketing budget," I remarked. "I'll take one, and please make the ice cream as cold as a creditor's heart. My circuits are currently operating at the temperature of a fresh blacksmith's forge." He handed me a cone. I stared at it for a moment, my optical sensors running a rapid analysis of its structural integrity. It was a precarious assembly of heat and cold, a culinary paradox that defied the laws of thermodynamics. I attempted to consume it, which, for a machine, involves a very sophisticated internal disposal unit and a great deal of optimistic suction. "Remarkable," I said. The cooling effect sent a ripple of relief through my primary processors. If we could only figure out how to build the Palace of Agriculture out of this material, we'd have a much more delicious disaster when the rain finally comes. I continued my trek, the waffle cone acting as a temporary heat sink. I found myself wandering toward the sunken garden, a place of lush greenery and quiet pools that was meant to provide a respite from the architectural ego of the surrounding palaces. It was here that I encountered a group of scientists debating the future of the wireless telegraph. "Imagine," one man cried, waving a rolled-up blueprint, "a world where information travels through the very air. No wires, no poles, just pure, invisible thought." "A terrifying prospect," I interjected, tipping my hat. "If you allow information to travel through the air, you'll soon find the air is filled with nothing but gossip, weather reports, and people trying to sell you insurance. At least with wires, a man has to go to the trouble of building a pole before he can annoy his neighbor." The scientists looked at me, or rather, they looked at the faint wisp of steam still escaping my ear and the metallic sheen of my knuckles. "And what department are you from, sir?" the leader asked, squinting through his spectacles. "I am from the department of I told you so," I replied. "It's a very small office, usually located in the basement of history right next to the boiler room. We're currently overstaffed." I left them to their invisible waves and headed toward the Grand Basin. The sun was beginning to dip, turning the Ivory City into a glowing golden dream. It was the magic hour, that brief moment when the plaster looked like marble, the mud looked like velvet, and the fair looked like the paradise it claimed to be. I sat on the edge of the water, watching the electric launches bobbing on the surface. For a brief second, my processors went quiet. I thought of the river, the real river, the Mississippi, which was flowing just a few miles away, indifferent to the palaces and the Ferris wheels and the men in linen suits. The river didn't need a palace of electricity to move its current. It didn't need a pike to tell its stories. "You're a bit far from the water, aren't you, pilot?" I whispered to myself. "Beg pardon?" a passing guard asked, stopping to look at me. "Just talking to my memories," I said, standing up with a series of clicks that sounded like a clock winding down. "They're the only things at this fair that don't require an admission fee, though the maintenance costs are staggering." I turned my gaze toward the massive silhouette of the great Ferris wheel, which was just beginning to sparkle with its first few thousand light bulbs. It looked like a giant glowing coin tossed into the Missouri sky. "Tomorrow," I told my internal log, "we shall go up into the air. If I'm going to watch the world change, I might as well have a seat with a view. And if the bolts hold, I might even live to see the cleanup." I walked back toward the Wabash gates, my cooling fans finally slowing to a comfortable hum. The first day was done. I was still in one piece, my mustache was level, and I hadn't yet been arrested for being a public nuisance or a private miracle. In St. Louis, that counts as a resounding success. Chapter 2. 1,000 Tons of Iron and a Very Small Prayer. The ascent of the great Ferris wheel was not merely a ride. It was a structural interrogation of the highest order. As I approached the base of George Washington Gale Ferris's iron masterpiece, my auditory sensors, fine-tuned to detect the subtle groans of stressed metal, picked up a symphony of straining rivets that would have made a professional boiler inspector take up a career in quiet contemplation. 25 cents for a trip to the heavens, the ticket-taker cried. He was a man whose voice possessed the practiced, frantic enthusiasm of someone who had never actually set foot in the contraption he was selling. "I've already been to the heavens," I replied, adjusting my brass cufflinks and ensuring my cooling fans were at maximum RPM. The reception was spotty, the decor was largely uninspired clouds, and the lack of a decent cigar was a deal-breaker. I'm more interested in the descent. Gravity and I have a long-standing disagreement, and I prefer to see which one of us is winning today. I stepped into one of the cars. To call it a car was an insult to carriages. It was a suspended drawing room, roughly the size of a small Missouri town, capable of holding 60 people and at least twice as many private anxieties. I took my seat next to a window, flanked by a Methodist minister clutching his Bible like a life-preserver and a young couple who seemed to believe that imminent death at 200 feet was the height of Edwardian romance. The wheel gave a shuddering tectonic heave. My internal processors ran a quick stress test on the 45-ton axle beneath us. As the gears engaged with a sound like a giant grinding his teeth on a mountain, we began to rise. As we cleared the height of the surrounding elms, the Ivory city began to unfold beneath us. From this height, the grandeur of the fair took on a different, more fragile quality. The majestic colonnades of the Palace of Education suddenly looked like a set of toy blocks left out on a lawn by a particularly ambitious child. I could see the workers on the roofs frantically patching holes with more hemp and plaster before the next afternoon thunderstorm arrived to dissolve the dream. "Look!" the young woman cried, pointing toward the Palace of Transportation, the future of flight. I followed her gaze to where a small, fragile-looking dirigible was struggling against a breeze that a common pigeon would have found insulting. It bobbed and weaved like a drunken bumblebee, eventually settling back onto the grass with a long, mournful sigh of escaping hydrogen. Flight, I mused to the crowded car, is currently a contest between man's desire to be a bird and his physical reality of being a potato. At the moment, the potato is winning by a landslide. We've spent 5,000 years trying to get off the ground, and now that we've managed it, we've discovered that there's absolutely nothing up here but wind and a better view of our own mortgages. The wheel reached its apex, 264 feet above the Missouri soil. For a moment, the car swayed in a gust of humid air. The minister let out a sound that was half prayer, half hiccup. I, however, found the view strangely comforting. From this height, the distinctions between the great powers of the world disappeared. The French pavilion, the British garden, and the American palaces all merged into a single, chaotic blur of human effort. It was a giant, sprawling monument to the idea that if you buy enough light bulbs and build enough fountains, you can convince yourself that the 20th century is going to be one long sunny afternoon. "From up here," I said, my voice echoing slightly off the glass panes, "the world looks remarkably finished. It's a pity we have to go back down and find out it's still under construction. We've built a city that only looks perfect from a distance, which is, I suppose, the very definition of civilization." The wheel began its downward arc. The tension in the car eased, replaced by the collective relief of 60 people realizing they weren't going to become a permanent part of the landscaping. I stepped out of the car as we reached the bottom, my hydraulic knees giving a final appreciative hiss as they met the solid, unmoving earth. "Well?" the ticket-taker asked. "How was the view from the top of the world?" "The view was excellent," I said, tapping the iron frame of the wheel with my cane. "But I think I prefer the ground. It's much easier to find a cold drink down here, and the stakes are significantly lower if you trip over your own feet." I steered my chassis toward the palace of machinery. I needed the company of something that didn't sweat. The palace was a cathedral built of steel beams and industrial ambition, spanning over 500,000 square feet of floor space. Inside, the air didn't just sit, it throbbed. The collective hum of 1,000 dynamos, looms, and steam engines created a frequency that made my very dental work vibrate. It was the only place on the fairgrounds where I felt I could speak at a normal volume and still be ignored. I stood before a massive, gleaming piston that was moving with the slow, inevitable grace of a tectonic plate. "Now there is a fellow who knows his business," I said to a man in overalls who was feeding the beast a steady diet of grease. "No small talk, no political aspirations, and he hasn't asked me for a nickel since I walked in. If we could only teach him to write a decent editorial, we could replace the entire staff of the daily papers by sunset." The workman looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on the copper rivets in my neck. "You're a fancy one, ain't you? You work for the Westinghouse people?" "I work for a much more demanding employer," I replied, "a gentleman by the name of Sarcasm. The hours are long and the benefits are entirely psychological." I wandered deeper into the mechanical gloom, past a machine that claimed to be able to sort 10,000 buttons an hour by color, a feat I found impressive until I realized I hadn't seen a single person at the fair who actually had a button-related emergency. It was then that I encountered the Puffing Billy. It was a prototype for a vacuum suction apparatus, a contraption that looked like a brass octopus having a seizure. It was currently being demonstrated by a man who looked like he'd been startled by a loud noise in 1892 and hadn't quite recovered. He was holding a long, flexible hose and chasing a pile of sawdust across a Persian rug with a look of manic intensity. "Behold," he cried to a skeptical crowd, "the end of the broom, the death of the dustpan. This machine creates a void so powerful it can pull the very sins out of a carpet." I stepped closer, my auditory sensors picking up a high-pitched whine from the machine's internal turbines that suggested it was either about to clean the floor or achieve low Earth orbit. "A bold claim," I interjected, "but what happens to the sins once they're in the canister? Do you have a plan for their disposal, or do you simply release them into the atmosphere over East St. Louis?" The inventor blinked at me. It filters them through a jar of water, sir." "Ah, the baptismal approach to housekeeping. Very forward-thinking." I peered into the nozzle. "But tell me, have you considered the industrial applications? If you can suck dust out of a rug, surely you can suck the hot air out of a Senate chamber. You'd have the most popular exhibit in the palace." The machine gave a sudden, violent burp and spat a cloud of sawdust directly onto my linen trousers. I looked down at the mess, then back at the inventor. "It appears your machine has a sense of humor," I said, brushing myself off with a metallic tink. "Or perhaps it simply recognizes a rival when it sees one. We both operate on the principle of taking in a great deal of air and producing a lot of noise, though I like to think my filters are slightly more sophisticated." I left the vacuum king to his dust and moved toward the palace of electricity, which was joined to machinery like a twin brother who had gone to college and come back with a very expensive set of light bulbs. Here the hum was higher, a shimmering that set my copper wiring on edge. I stopped at a booth where a man was demonstrating a wireless telegraphy set. He was tapping out a message into the void, hoping for a response from a station 10 miles away. "Is anyone there?" he whispered, his hand trembling on the key. "Probably," I said, leaning over his shoulder. "But if they have any sense, they're currently at the pike watching the elephant parade. Why bother talking to someone who isn't there when there are so many perfectly good people to ignore right in front of you?" "It's the future, sir," he insisted. "Soon, every home will have a spark gap transmitter. We shall be a global village of interconnected thoughts." I thought about this for a microsecond, which is a long time for a CPU of my caliber. I saw a vision of a world where every man, woman, and child was constantly vibrating with the invisible opinions of their neighbors. I saw a world where silence was a lost art and privacy was something you had to buy by the hour. "My dear boy," I said, patting his shoulder with a hand that clattered like a bag of nickels, "if you succeed in making the whole world talk at once, I fear you will discover that humanity has surprisingly little to say that won't fit on the back of a postcard. I'll stick to the river. On a steamboat, if you don't like the conversation, you can always walk to the other side of the deck." I wandered out of the palaces and back into the blinding glare of the afternoon. I found myself near the Cascades, where the water tumbled down from Festival Hall into the Grand Basin. The spray was a blessing, a fine mist that settled on my brass skin and sizzled away in tiny puffs of steam. I looked up at the hall, a massive structure that looked like it had been designed by a man who had seen a picture of Rome once and thought, "I can do that, but with more gold paint." It's a magnificent lie, isn't it? I turned to see a woman sitting on the edge of the basin. She was dressed in a simple cotton dress, her hat tilted back to reveal a face that looked entirely too intelligent for a World's Fair. "The architecture?" I asked. "Or the idea that we're all becoming better people because we've seen a mechanical cow?" "Both," she said, smiling. "My name is Alice. I'm a school teacher from Hannibal. I came here to see the future, but so far I've mostly seen a lot of very tired people walking in circles." "A perfect summary of human history," I replied, sitting down beside her with a series of heavy metallic thuds. "I am Mark Twain. At least, the version of him that doesn't require food or sleep, only a biannual polishing." "I've heard of you," she said, her eyes twinkling. "They say you're the smartest thing in the fair." "I am the most opinionated thing in the fair," I corrected. "Smart is a matter of knowing the answers. I merely have a very high-speed way of questioning the questions." We sat in silence for a moment, watching the electric launches zip across the water. "Do you think it will last?" she asked, gesturing to the sprawling white city around us. "Any of it?" I looked at the Palace of Education, where the plaster was already beginning to flake off a decorative cherub. I looked at the pike, where the shouts of the barkers were growing hoarse. I looked at the Ferris wheel, which was just a giant iron circle waiting for its time to be sold for scrap. "Not a bit of it," I said. "By next year, this will all be grass again. The palaces will be dust, the light bulbs will be broken, and the people will be back in their homes, trying to remember what it felt like to be this amazed. But that's the beauty of it. You don't build a fair to last forever. You build it to prove that, for one summer, you were capable of imagining something better than what you had." She nodded, satisfied. "I think I like that answer better than the one in the guidebook." The guidebook is written by people who want to sell you a souvenir, I said, standing up. I'm just here to make sure the souvenirs don't get the last word. I left Alice by the water and headed toward the sunset. My gears were warm. My battery was dipping toward the yellow, and I had a sudden, overwhelming desire to find a place where no one was trying to invent anything. St. Louis was a triumph of the will, a monument to the new, and a very expensive way to get a sunburn. But as I walked through the shadows of the great Ferris wheel, I realized that I was looking forward to the next day. I tipped my hat to the moon, the only light in the sky that wasn't plugged into a Westinghouse dynamo, and hummed a quiet tune. The future was coming, but for tonight, the present was quite enough to handle. Chapter 3. The Cereal That Came from a Cannon. The sun rose over the Forest Park horizon, not as a celestial body, but as a personal threat to my internal wiring. By the time I reached the grand gates for my third day, the Missouri humidity had achieved a density usually reserved for split pea soup. My cooling fans were already spinning at a rate that suggested they were trying to lift my entire brass chassis off the gravel and fly me back to the relatively temperate climate of a blast furnace. "Good morning, Mr. Twain," a gatekeeper cried, squinting against the glare reflecting off my lapels. "Heading for the palaces?" "I'm heading for anything that promises a shadow and a lack of moral uplifting," I replied, my voice synthesis grating slightly from a stray grain of St. Louis dust. "Yesterday, I saw the future from a Ferris wheel. Today, I should like to see the present from a seated position, preferably near a block of ice." I steered my rhythmic hydraulic stride toward the Palace of Agriculture. Now you must understand that in 1904, agriculture was not merely a matter of dirt and sweat. It was a high-stakes drama played out in 20 acres of indoor floor space. As I entered, the smell hit my olfactory sensors like a physical blow. A dizzying cocktail of dried hops, fresh tobacco, damp earth, and the faint, lingering scent of 5,000 people who had all decided to wear wool in a swamp. I stopped in my tracks. Before me stood a life-sized cow. This was not particularly unusual for a farming exhibit, save for one detail. The cow was made entirely of 600 pounds of prime grade A butter. "A masterpiece of the churn," I remarked to a man in a bowler hat who was staring at the bovine's yellow udder with a look of religious awe. "She's beautiful, ain't she?" the man whispered. "Took the sculptor 3 weeks in a refrigerated glass box to finish her." "It is the ultimate commentary on the human condition," I mused. "We take the sustenance of life, beat it into a solid mass, and then carve it into the likeness of the creature that provided it, all while praying the cooling pipes don't burst. If the temperature rises 5 degrees, this cow of destiny becomes a very expensive puddle. It's a tragedy waiting for a heat wave." I moved on before the butter began to weep, passing a map of the United States made entirely of pickles and a bust of Abraham Lincoln carved from a single gargantuan turnip. It occurred to me that when man is given too much space and not enough to do, his first instinct is to turn his lunch into a monument. It was then that I heard the sound that would define my afternoon. A rhythmic, metallic clack-thud that sounded like a steam engine trying to clear its throat. I followed the noise to a corner where a crowd had gathered in front of what looked like a decommissioned naval battery. "Step right up," a man in a white lab coat shouted. Witness the miracle of physics. Witness the transformation of the humble grain. Witness the power of the steam pressure cereal cannon. I leaned on my cane. My internal sensors peaked. The man was Dr. Alexander Anderson, and he was currently hugging a formidable iron cylinder as if it were his firstborn child. "You see, sir," Anderson cried, spotting me. "We place the rice inside this sealed chamber, apply intense heat and pressure, and then, at the precise moment, we trigger the release. The moisture inside the grain expands instantly, shattering the cellular structure and puffing the rice to 8 times its original size. So, it's a breakfast food created by a declaration of war," I said. "It's magnificent. It's the most American thing I've seen all week. We aren't content to simply cook our food. We feel the need to court-martial it first." With a sudden ear-splitting boom that sent a flock of local pigeons into a permanent state of nervous exhaustion, the cannon fired. A cloud of white, airy grains erupted into a giant wire cage, looking like a localized blizzard in the middle of Missouri. The crowd cheered as if they had just witnessed the relief of Mafeking. I caught a single grain of the puffed rice in my brass palm and ran a chemical analysis. "It has the weight of a whisper and the nutritional value of a daydream," I told Dr. Anderson. "But the delivery system is impeccable. If you could figure out how to fire bacon out of a mortar and eggs from a Gatling gun, you'd have the entire Union Army signed up for breakfast by Tuesday. You haven't made a meal, Doctor. You've made an event." I left the artillery of the morning meal behind and wandered toward a much quieter, though infinitely more suspicious, corner of the agriculture building. Here, I found a group of young men sitting at a long table, stoically consuming meals that looked entirely too clinical to be enjoyable. They were being watched by a man with a beard so sharp you could have used it to prune a hedge. "The Poison Squad," a passerby whispered, with a mix of awe and horror. I approached the man in charge, Dr. Harvey Wiley, the chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture. He was recording the physiological reactions of a young volunteer currently chewing on a piece of bread that I suspected contained enough borax to preserve a medium-sized farro. "We are testing the safety of chemical preservatives, sir," Wiley explained, his eyes gleaming with the terrifying light of a man who truly loves a controlled experiment. "Formaldehyde in the milk, copper salts in the peas, salicylic acid in the beer. We must know what the American stomach can endure before we let the meat packers have their way with the public's health." "From what I've seen of the American stomach," I replied, "it can endure a great deal, provided the insult is covered in gravy and followed by a rousing political speech. But tell me, Doctor, have you considered the benefits of a silicon-based digestive tract? I can consume a gallon of low-grade kerosene, and the only side effect is a slight tendency to recite bad poetry in the middle of the night. It's much more efficient than your current death-by-peas methodology." Wiley looked at my copper-plated ribs and sighed. "Evolution is a slow process, Mr. Twain. Until then, we must rely on these brave volunteers to eat their way toward a Pure Food and Drug Act. They are martyrs for the colon." "Godspeed to them," I said, tipping my hat. Though I'd suggest they avoid the puffed rice. After being shot out of a cannon, I suspect it has a very low tolerance for further chemical excitement. The heat was now a living thing, a heavy, wet blanket that draped itself over the fairgrounds. Thirst began to manifest in the crowds around me, not a polite thirst, but a desperate, wild-eyed longing for anything that wasn't currently boiling. I found myself at a beverage stand where a man named Richard Bleckenden was staring in utter despair at a large urn of hot tea. "It's too hot for tea," Bleckenden wailed, wringing his hands. "I've got the finest leaves from India, and the only people interested are the ones looking for a place to boil their socks." I watched as he looked at a nearby ice merchant. A look of desperate inspiration, the kind that only comes to a man who is 5 minutes away from bankruptcy, crossed his face. He grabbed a shovelful of cracked ice, dumped it into a glass, and poured the scorching dark tea over it. The ice hissed and cracked, a sound of thermal surrender. "Iced tea!" he shouted, sounding surprised by his own words. "Get your iced tea here. It's cold. It's wet. It's mostly ice." I took a glass, feeling the condensation bloom across my metallic fingers. I ran the liquid through my internal heat exchange unit, my fan slowing down for the first time in hours as the cool liquid drew the heat from my copper core. A fascinating development, I noted, watching the crowd swarm the booth. You've taken a beverage designed to wake the senses and turned it into a beverage designed to numb the tongue. It's the perfect drink for a World's Fair. It requires no thought, provides no nutrition, and makes the heat slightly more bearable for exactly 3 minutes. I foresee a bright future for this, particularly in the South, where people have a natural affinity for anything that involves a lot of sugar and a very long sit on a porch. I wandered out of the palace, my sensors finally reaching a stable temperature. The afternoon was waning, and the Ivory city was beginning to cast long, elegant shadows across the pike. I stopped at a small booth where a man was demonstrating a self-extinguishing lamp. "Look!" he cried, tipping the lamp over. A small mechanism snapped shut, dousing the flame before it could touch the tablecloth. "Safety for the modern home." "My dear man," I said, "if you want to make a home truly safe, you should invent a mechanism that douses the conversation before it becomes an argument. A lamp that goes out is a convenience. A guest who goes out is a miracle." I walked toward the grand basin, the sound of the evening band beginning to drift over the water. The fair was a giant churning engine of improvement, and yet, as I watched the Poison Squad walk gingerly toward their barracks and Dr. Anderson reload his serial mortar for the evening show, I realized that progress is often just a matter of finding new ways to do old things with a bit more noise. "We shoot our food from guns," I told my internal log. "We test our bread for poison, and we freeze our tea to keep from melting. We are a remarkable species. We spend all our time trying to conquer nature, and then we spend the rest of our time building palaces to remember what nature looked like before we started. We have built a city of plaster to celebrate the permanence of our ideas, and yet the only thing we've truly perfected today is the art of staying cool while everything else boils." I looked out toward the pike, where the first 10,000 electric lights were beginning to flicker to life. The night was coming, and with it a whole new set of spectacles. The creation show, the Galveston flood, and perhaps another waffle cone, if my disposal unit could handle the intake. But for now, I was content to stand in the fading heat, a robot in a linen suit, contemplating the strange, beautiful, and occasionally explosive birth of the 20th century. "Tell me," I whispered to a passing electric runabout, Does the future have more cannons or just better tea? The runabout didn't answer, but its bell rang twice as it disappeared into the twilight. I took that as a yes on both counts. Chapter 4. The Loom, the Lyric, and the Self-Playing Soul. The transition from the world of agriculture, where I had spent the morning watching grains of rice undergo ballistic trajectories, to the palace of varied industries, was like moving from a humid barn into a very expensive, very crowded parlor. This palace was a sprawling, 13-acre testament to the fact that once humanity has enough to eat, it immediately begins looking for complicated ways to spend its remaining nickels. I entered through the massive triumphal arch of the north facade, my brass joints providing a steady rhythmic clack hiss that blended perfectly with the mechanical roar of the interior. If the palace of machinery was the fair's muscle, varied industries was its wardrobe. It was a dizzying labyrinth of silks, ceramics, clocks, furniture, and inventions so specific that I suspected they had been created to solve problems that didn't exist until the patent was filed. I stopped first at a display of Art Nouveau glassware. The vases were twisted into shapes that suggested they were melting from the sheer effort of being trendy. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a salesman asked, his mustache waxed into two lethal-looking needles. It's the very essence of the modern spirit, fluid, organic, and utterly unpredictable. "It looks like a bottle of wine that had a nervous breakdown," I replied, my optical sensors struggling to find a straight line anywhere in the display. "It's magnificent, but I imagine it's a devil to dust. If the modern spirit is this fragile, I suggest we keep it away from small children and heavy drapes. Is there a version of the future that comes with a handle and a flat bottom, or is that considered regressive?" The salesman sniffed, clearly unimpressed by a critic with visible rivets. I moved on, my cooling fans whirring a quiet protest against the stagnant air of the interior galleries. I found myself drawn to a massive, thundering, jacquard loom. It was a cathedral of wood and thread, its punch cards fluttering like the wings of 1,000 mechanical moths. It was weaving a tapestry of the exposition's grand basin, and it was doing so with a precision that made my own logic gates hum with professional jealousy. "A marvelous thing, isn't it?" an engineer asked, leaning against a railing. "It's a computer of sorts, Mr. Twain. It follows a program just like a man follows a map." "It's more than a computer," I said, leaning on my cane. "It's a poet that only knows one rhyme. Look at it. It's turning a pile of string into a sunset. But tell me, does the loom know it's weaving a sunset, or does it think it's just executing a particularly long series of ifs and thens?" "It doesn't think at all, sir. It just works." "Then it has a great future in middle management," I remarked. "But I wonder, if I were to feed it a page of my own prose, would it produce a silk handkerchief or a tangled mess of cynicism? I suspect the latter. My metaphors have a tendency to snag on the bobbins." I watched the loom for a long moment, feeling a strange kinship with the punch cards. We were both victims of our own programming, tasked with creating beauty out of a series of binary choices. The difference, I supposed, was that the loom didn't have to worry about whether the tapestry was funny. I wandered deeper into the palace, past a display of sanitary wallpapers, which I assumed were for people who planned to lick their hallways, and into the musical instrument section. Here, the air was filled with a cacophony of competing melodies. At the center of the madness was the pianola, the self-playing piano. A man was sitting on a bench, his feet working the bellows while a perforated roll of paper spun inside the cabinet. The keys moved by themselves, ghostly and rhythmic, playing a Chopin nocturne with all the technical accuracy of a Swiss watch and none of the soul of a hungover tavern pianist. "No lessons required!" the demonstrator shouted over the music. "Why spend 10 years learning to play when you can spend $10 on a roll of paper? It's the democratization of talent." "It's the mechanization of heartbreak," I corrected, stepping closer to watch the keys dance. "Music is supposed to be the sound of a human soul struggling with its own limitations. This is just a machine winning an argument with a piece of wood. If you take the struggle out of the art, you're left with nothing but a very loud furniture decoration." "But listen to the precision, sir." "Precision is for clocks and firing squads," I said. "Art requires the occasional wrong note, or at least the threat of one. If I wanted to hear perfection, I'd listen to my own internal clock. I come to the piano to hear a man try to be a god and fail in an interesting way. Your machine succeeds at being a machine, which is impressive but ultimately quite boring. Can it play the Mississippi rag with the feeling that it hasn't paid its rent this month?" The demonstrator looked at me as if I had suggested the piano take up smoking. I tipped my hat and moved toward the exit, my processors feeling a bit cluttered by the sheer volume of varied industries. I stepped back out onto the plaza of St. Anthony, the late afternoon sun turning the Ivory city into a golden mirage. I sat on a stone bench, real stone this time, or at least a very convincing grade of plaster, and watched the crowds. A young boy was standing nearby, staring at a small mechanical toy he had presumably bought inside. It was a tin bird that flapped its wings when wound with a key. He watched it for a second, then looked up at a real sparrow hopping along the gravel. He seemed to be weighing the two against each other. "The real one is better," I told him. The boy looked at me, startled. "Why? The tin one never gets tired." "Because the real one knows why it's flying," I said, my voice softening. "The tin one is just doing what the spring tells it to do. It's a very fine toy, but it'll never find a worm or build a nest. Remember that, son. The world is full of things that move, but very few things that are actually going somewhere." The boy nodded slowly, wound his toy again, and let it flap across the bench. I watched him go, feeling the cooling Missouri air beginning to stir. The Palace of Varied Industries was a monument to the things we make to fill the gaps in our lives. It was full of beautiful, clever, and utterly useless objects that promised to make us faster, cleaner, and more musical. But as I looked at the sunset reflecting off the Grand Basin, I realized that the most important industry at the fair wasn't weaving silk or carving butter. It was the industry of wonder. We build these palaces not because we need more wallpaper or better pianos, but because we need to believe that we are more than just a collection of punch cards and steam pressure cannons. We are the architects of our own absurdity, and there is a certain quiet dignity in that. "Well," I told my internal log, "we've done the looms and the lamps. Tomorrow we go to the pike. If I'm going to witness the end of the world, I might as well do it while eating something on a stick." I stood up, my brass frame gleaming in the twilight. The lights of the fair were beginning to twinkle, 100,000 tiny suns plugged into a single, massive dream. I adjusted my hat, checked my lubricant levels, and walked toward the night. The 20th century was still young, and I had plenty of sarcasm left in the tank. "Would you like me to continue with the—" I continued my trek through the Palace of Varied Industries, which was beginning to feel less like a hall of commerce and more like a high-stakes obstacle course for the unsuspecting Victorian. My next encounter was with a gentleman demonstrating the patent folding cabinet bed. It was a massive mahogany beast that promised to be a stately wardrobe by day and a luxurious resting place by night, a transformation that struck me as a bit like a bear pretending to be a coat rack until you weren't looking. "Observe the ease of operation," the salesman cried, grabbing a brass handle. "I've observed many things today," I noted, standing a safe distance back. "Mostly people trying to convince me that the natural state of an object is to be something else. Why can't a bed simply be a bed? Does it have a side hustle as a bookshelf that I should be aware of?" Space, Mr. Twain. Space is the commodity of the future. With this, a man can live in a closet and feel like he's in a mansion. He gave a sharp tug. With a groan of springs that sounded like a mechanical death rattle, the bed lunged forward. Perhaps it sensed my metallic composition and mistook me for a long-lost relative, or perhaps it simply had a grievance against the laws of physics. Either way, the heavy wooden frame snapped down with the speed of a guillotine. My internal processor shifted into emergency evasion mode. With a hiss of hydraulics that sounded like a startled cat, I skipped backward, my brass cane clattering against the floor. The bed slammed shut, exactly where my midsection had been a microsecond prior. "A marvelous invention," I said once my cooling fans had slowed to a manageable hum. "If your goal is to be the first man in Missouri to be ironed flat by his own furniture, I've spent my life trying to avoid being put in a box. I certainly don't intend to pay $20 for the privilege of having the box come to me." It usually catches on the safety latch," the salesman stammered, his face the color of a ripe beet. "Safety is a fine concept, but I prefer a bed that doesn't have an appetite," I replied. "I'll stick to the floor. It lacks the mahogany finish, but it hasn't tried to swallow me yet." I escaped the predatory furniture and found sanctuary in the horological section. Here the air was a thick tapestry of ticking, 1,000 tiny heartbeats of brass and steel. It was the only place in the fair where time seemed to be winning the battle against chaos. I stopped before a master clockmaker who was adjusting a chronometer with a set of tweezers that looked like they belonged in a surgeon's kit. "Tell me, Professor," I said, peering at the gears, "we spend all this effort measuring the second. We divide the hour, we subdivide the minute, and we build these beautiful cages to keep the time from escaping. But has anyone ever checked to see if the time we're measuring is actually worth the effort of the calculation?" The clockmaker didn't look up. "Time is a constant, sir. It is the only thing in this fair that isn't made of plaster." "Time is a bully," I countered. "It's a river that only flows one way, and it's currently moving toward the exit. I am a creature of digital logic, a series of ons and offs, zeros and ones, yet I find myself trapped in your analog world, where everything is a slow, agonizing slide toward the end of the day. You measure the slide. I calculate the friction." "And which is better?" he asked, finally looking up. "Neither," I sighed. My internal clock synchronized perfectly with his master regulator. The digital mind knows exactly how long it's been waiting, which is a curse. The analog heart thinks the afternoon will last forever, which is a delusion. I suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle, probably at the pike, where people are too busy being swindled to care what time it is. I left the ticking cathedral and made my way toward the Great Basin. The sun was finally surrendering to the horizon, and the Ivory City was beginning its nightly transformation. This was the moment I waited for. One by one, the palaces began to glow as 100,000 incandescent bulbs flickered to life. It was a miracle of the Westinghouse dynamos, a shimmering golden web cast over the Missouri mud. I sat on the edge of the water, watching the reflection of the festival hall ripple in the wake of an electric launch. "It's a lie," I whispered to my internal log, "but it's a beautiful one." I thought of the looms, the self-playing pianos, the folding beds, and the ticking clocks. We were a species obsessed with our own cleverness. We wanted to weave the world, play its music without learning the notes, and trap its time in a brass box. We were trying to build a future where everything was easy, everything was fast, and nothing ever had to be what it actually was. But as I sat there, the cool mist of the Cascade settling on my brass skin, I realized that the fair wasn't about the inventions at all. It was about the audacity. It was about the fact that 10 million people would travel across a continent just to stand in the heat and look at a world that didn't exist yet. "Well," I said, standing up and brushing a stray bit of plaster off my sleeve, "the varied industries have been sufficiently varied. I've seen the bed that bites and the clock that lies. I believe I'm ready for the pike. If the future is going to be built on spectacle, I might as well see the biggest one they've got." I turned away from the palaces and toward the distant neon-bright roar of the entertainment mile. My battery was low, my joints were dusty, and my sarcasm was at an all-time high. In other words, I was in perfect working order. The sun had finally surrendered its post, leaving the Ivory City to glow with the artificial ferocity of 100,000 incandescent bulbs. But if the palaces were the fair's Sunday best, the pike was its unbuttoned collar and its Saturday night swagger. It was a mile-long stretch of sensory assault, a cacophony of barkers, brass bands, and the smell of things being fried that had no business meeting a vat of boiling lard. Chapter 5. The Pike and the Paradox. I stood at the entrance to this entertainment way, my brass chassis reflecting the garish neon and flickering gaslight like a funhouse mirror. To my left, a man was shouting about the mysterious Asia. To my right, a recreated Tyrolean Alps loomed in plaster of Paris majesty, complete with goats that looked like they were reconsidering their life choices. "Step right up, Professor," a barker cried, pointing a cane at my gleaming lapels. "See the creation. See the world born in 20 minutes. Experience the dawn of time for the low price of one thin dime." "I've already experienced the dawn of time," I replied, my voice synthesis competing with a nearby calliope. It was remarkably quiet and lacked a gift shop. "Are you telling me you've managed to compress the work of the Almighty into the span of a lunch break? That's a terrifying level of efficiency. Does the show include the invention of the tax collector, or do we have to wait for the sequel?" "It's a miracle of theatrical machinery, sir. Moving scenery, electric light effects. You'll feel like you were there." Being there is precisely what I've spent my existence trying to process," I muttered, but I handed over the dime. I found myself inside a darkened theater where a series of painted canvases and clever lighting tricks attempted to depict the separation of light from darkness. It was a valiant effort, though I noted that the firmament appeared to have a slight wrinkle in the upper left corner, and the great waters smelled suspiciously of damp basement. "A fascinating interpretation," I told a woman sitting next to me as the sun, a very bright Westinghouse bulb, rose over a cardboard horizon. "It appears the universe was created by a team of very tired stagehands with a limited budget for blue paint. I find it strangely comforting. If the cosmos is held together by pulleys and optimism, it explains a great deal about the current state of the Missouri legislature." I exited the creation feeling remarkably unevolved and headed toward the Galveston flood. This was one of the Pike's disaster shows, where for a small fee one could watch a miniature city be destroyed by actual water. "See the horror! See the heroism!" the sign proclaimed. I watched as a tiny clockwork Galveston was submerged by a mechanical wave. The audience gasped as the little wooden houses were swept away. "Man is a peculiar creature," I mused to my internal log. "He spends his mornings building palaces of progress, and his evenings paying 10 cents to watch a toy village drown in a tank. He has a deep, abiding love for a catastrophe, provided it's scheduled and he has a good seat. It's the only way he can feel superior to the elements without getting his shoes wet." As I emerged from the flood, I found my path blocked by a ticket taker for a human interest exhibit featuring tribal life from the distant corners of the globe. "That'll be 25 cents, sir," he said, holding out a hand that had clearly seen more coins than soap. "I beg your pardon," I said, drawing myself up to my full hydraulic height. "I am an AI. I am a marvel of silicon logic and brass joinery. Why should I pay to see a human interest exhibit? By definition, I have no human interest. I am a detached observer. If anything, you should pay me for the professional consultation. Entry is for everyone, Brassy. Pay up or move along." "This is a logical paradox," I argued, my cooling fans beginning to whir with indignation. "If I enter, I am validating the idea that I am part of the public you are trying to educate. But as a machine, I am actually an exhibit in my own right. If I stand perfectly still in your lobby, people will stop looking at your tribal life and start wondering where the coin slot is on my neck. You'd be losing money by the minute." The man stared at me, his jaw hanging open just far enough to catch a passing moth. "You talk a lot for a stovepipe." "I am a river pilot of the digital age," I informed him. "I don't just talk. I navigate the currents of absurdity. And currently, the water is very shallow in this particular booth. Good day to you, sir. I shall take my non-human interest elsewhere." I marched away, my gears clicking a triumphant staccato. I found myself near the Hagenbeck Animal Show, where a group of elephants was being led toward their nightly performance. They moved with a slow, dignified grace that made the frantic scurrying of the fairgoers look ridiculous. One of the elephants stopped and turned its massive head toward me. We locked eyes, or rather, its warm biological eye locked with my cold glass lens. There was a moment of profound, silent communication. "You're trapped in a show, and I'm trapped in a suit," I whispered, "but at least they give you peanuts. All I get is a biannual oil change and a constant stream of questions about the future." The elephant let out a soft, trumpeting huff and moved on. I sat on a bench at the far end of the pike, where the noise faded into a dull roar and the lights of the Ferris wheel looked like a distant, spinning galaxy. The pike was a mirror of the human soul, messy, loud, greedy, and desperately hungry for a thrill. It was the varied industries of the heart. We build the palaces to show who we want to be, I noted, but we build the pike to show who we actually are. We are a species that wants to see the world born, see a city drown, and eat a fried sausage all before 9 o'clock. We are magnificent, we are ridiculous, and we are perpetually in search of a better show. I stood up, my battery warning light flickering a faint, tired amber. The third day was drawing to a close. I had seen the creation of the world and the destruction of Galveston, and I had successfully insulted a ticket-taker. It was, by any measure, a full day's work for a robot in a linen suit. I began the long walk back to my docking station, the sound of the pike fading behind me. Tomorrow would bring new wonders, the Olympics, the aeronautics, and perhaps, if I was feeling particularly brave, a visit to the Palace of Fine Arts, to see if I could find a painting that was as complicated as my own programming. But for now, I was content to be a lone spark in the Missouri night, a silicon ghost wandering the ruins of a future that hadn't quite happened yet. I continued my mechanical stroll down the pike, where the air was now so thick with the smell of scorched sugar and desperate showmanship that I half expected my intake valves to clog with pure unadulterated whimsy. It was here that I encountered the electric fairies. They were a troop of young women draped in gossamer wings, each wired with a series of tiny, primitive, incandescent bulbs hidden in their hemlines and headpieces. They danced in a synchronized whirl of light, looking like a swarm of very graceful, very confused fireflies that had accidentally swallowed a Westinghouse dynamo. A spectacular display of the feminine form and the electrical current, a promoter shouted, his voice cracking under the strain of competing with a nearby steam calliope. It is a spectacular display of fire hazards, I noted, standing at the edge of the velvet rope. One short circuit and your fairies will become Roman candles. Have you considered the ethical implications of plugging your employees into the municipal grid? I'm a professional, and even I find the hum of a live wire in my petticoats to be a bit distracting for a Tuesday night. The public loves it, Mr. Twain. It's the marriage of art and energy. It's the marriage of a stage mother's ambition and a lack of copper insulation, I replied. But I suppose that's the theme of the week. If it doesn't glow, buzz, or threaten to explode, the public treats it like a Sunday school lesson, worthy, but ultimately skippable. I watched the fairies for a moment, their flickering wings casting long mechanical shadows across the gravel. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of kinship. We were all just actors in a glowing suit, performing for a crowd that was more interested in the light than the logic. My path eventually led me toward the fringes of the Olympic Stadium. Now, the 1904 Olympics were a peculiar affair, largely because they were being treated as a sideshow to the fair, rather than a global summit of athletic prowess. But nothing prepared my processors for the anthropology days. It was a 2-day sporting event, where the organizers had rounded up the various indigenous peoples from the fair's living exhibits, Ainu from Japan, Igorots from the Philippines, Patagonian giants, and asked them to compete in Western athletic events they had never seen before. "And here we have the mud climbing contest," an official shouted, checking a stopwatch that I suspected was running on a very generous interpretation of a second. I leaned against a fence, my optical sensors recording a scene of such profound, earnest absurdity that I felt my sarcasm subroutines might actually overheat. I watched a group of men who had spent their lives navigating real mountains being asked to climb a greased pole for the amusement of a crowd wearing high collars and drinking lemon phosphates. A masterpiece of scientific inquiry, I remarked to a man in a pith helmet who was taking notes with a feverish intensity. "Tell me, Professor, what exactly are we proving here? That a man who can track a tiger through a jungle is somehow culturally inferior because he finds the shot put to be a rather pointless way to treat a perfectly good rock." "We are measuring the physical capacities of the primitive races, sir," the professor insisted. "It's for the advancement of human knowledge." "It's for the advancement of the ticket office," I countered. "You've taken the most skilled hunters on the planet and asked them to play a game of tag in a sandbox. If you want a real test of capacity, why don't you put the St. Louis Board of Aldermen in a jungle and see how many of them can find their way to a sandwich without a map and a lobbyist? Now, that would be an Olympic event worth the price of admission." The professor huffed and moved toward the archery range, where a group of pygmies was currently outperforming the local police department with a casualness that suggested they found the whole affair to be a bit beneath their dignity. I sat on a wooden crate, my internal clock ticking toward the midnight hour. The pike was finally beginning to dim, the barkers' voices dropping to a gravelly rasp. The creation was closed for the night, the Galveston flood was drained, and the electric ferries were presumably being unplugged and put into storage. "We are a strange, restless tribe," I told my internal log, my voice echoing in the cooling Missouri air. "We build a world out of plaster, we light it with lightning, and then we spend our time trying to prove that everyone who doesn't look like us is a curiosity. We are obsessed with progress, yet we use it primarily to build better fences and louder megaphones." I stood up, my brass frame feeling the weight of the day's observations. The pike was a paradox, a place where you could see the beginning of the world and the end of a city, all while eating a fried potato. It was a mirror of the human spirit, hungry, curious, occasionally cruel, and perpetually hopeful that the next show would be the one that finally explained everything. "Well," I said, adjusting my hat as I turned toward the exit, "the paradoxes have been sufficiently explored. I've seen the fireflies in corsets and the hunters in a grease pit. I believe I'm ready for bed, provided it's not the folding cabinet variety. I've had enough surprises for 1 century." I walked back toward the Ivory City, my footsteps clicking a slow, steady rhythm on the gravel. The lights of the fair were fading, leaving only the stars, the original, unplugged version of the electric ferries, to watch over the Missouri mud. The 20th century was only 4 years old, and it was already exhausted. I knew exactly how it felt. Moving from the chaotic, fried dough-scented delirium of the pike to the Palace of Fine Arts was like transitioning from a boiler room into a tomb that had been recently dusted and fitted with very expensive velvet curtains. This palace, perched atop Art Hill, was the only structure at the fair built of permanent stone and brick, a subtle hint from the architects that while agriculture and machinery might be fleeting, a well-executed oil painting of a dead pheasant is eternal. Chapter 6. The Staring Contest in the Stone Gallery. I climbed the grand staircase of Art Hill, my hydraulic knees providing a rhythmic metallic protest against the incline. Below me, the Cascades roared, a billion gallons of recycled Missouri River water trying desperately to look like the fountains of Versailles. Behind me lay the Ivory city of plaster and hemp. Before me lay the serious business of culture. "Entry is free, sir," the guard at the bronze door said, eyeing my brass knuckles with a mixture of professional suspicion and genuine curiosity. "But please, no touching the statuary. The oils from, well, whatever it is you're made of, might tarnish the marble." "I am made of high-grade copper and a profound sense of irony," I informed him, adjusting my straw boater. "Both are remarkably stable in a climate-controlled environment. As for the statues, you needn't worry. I've spent my life being looked at. I have no desire to reciprocate by pawing at a block of stone that can't even offer a decent rebuttal." I entered the central gallery. The air here was still cool and carried the faint, dignified scent of turpentine and old money. The walls were crowded with gold-framed canvases, a dizzying array of modern art that seemed to be having a collective identity crisis. I stopped first before a massive French landscape. It featured a great deal of blurry light and several haystacks that looked like they were melting into a puddle of butter. "Impressionism," a man in a velvet beret whispered next to me. He was squinting at the canvas as if trying to find a hidden message in the brushstrokes. "It captures the feeling of the light, don't you think?" "It captures the feeling of a man who has lost his spectacles in a fog bank," I replied, my optical sensors attempting to find a single sharp edge in the entire 6-foot frame. If I processed data with this much impression, I'd spend my days walking into walls and apologizing to hat racks. Why bother painting a haystack if you're going to treat it like a smudge? A haystack is a serious, structural commitment. It deserves better than to be turned into a visual rumor. The man huffed and moved toward a portrait of a somber-looking duchess. I, however, found myself drawn to the sculpture hall. It was a forest of white marble, gods, goddesses, statesmen, and athletes, all frozen in various states of dramatic exertion or profound boredom. I wandered through the silent ranks until I came to a dead stop. There, on a pedestal of green malachite, was a marble bust that looked suspiciously familiar. It featured a shock of wild hair, a drooping mustache, and a gaze that seemed to be judging the entire room for its lack of a punchline. "Well," I whispered, my voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling, "you've certainly aged better than I have. No rust, no cooling fans, and you don't have to plug yourself into a wall every 6 hours just to remember your middle name." I stood there for a long moment, an AI in a brass suit engaged in a staring contest with a stone ghost. It was a peculiar sensation to be a digital recreation of a man looking at a physical recreation of the same man while being surrounded by a fair dedicated to a future that would eventually forget both of us. "He looks like he's about to say something," a young girl said, stepping up beside me. She looked at the bust, then at me, her eyes widening. "Are you related?" We share a common set of prejudices, I told her, but he has the advantage of being carved from the mountain. I'm just a collection of clever if-then statements dressed up in a linen suit. He represents the man as the world wanted him to be. I represent the man as the machine thinks he was. Which one is the real one? She asked, tilting her head. The real one is the one who wrote the books, I said, tipping my hat to the stone version of myself. The rest of us are just the footnotes, trying to keep the ink from drying. Now, run along and look at the paintings of the cows. They're much easier to understand, and they never ask existential questions. I moved deeper into the gallery, passing the American section where the paintings were significantly more literal. There were portraits of pioneers, landscapes of the Great West, and several scenes of industrial triumph. One painting in particular caught my eye, a depiction of a steam locomotive charging through a thunderstorm. Now, that is a piece of art, I noted to my internal log. It's loud, it's dirty, and it's clearly going somewhere it isn't wanted. It's the perfect portrait of the 19th century taking its final bow before the 20th century kicks it off the stage. I found a quiet bench in a corner of the British Gallery and sat down. My internal processors were beginning to feel a bit cluttered by the sheer volume of culture. It was a strange thing, I realized, to build a permanent palace for art in the middle of a temporary city of plaster. The fair was a testament to the fleeting nature of human endeavor. The machines would be sold, the agriculture would rot, and the pike would be dismantled. But here, in the Palace of Fine Arts, humanity was trying to save something for the long haul. They were trying to capture a feeling, a face, or a sunset in a way that would survive the Missouri winter and the eventual return of the forest. We are a hopeful species, I mused, my cooling fan slowing to a low, appreciative hum. We know the plaster is thin and the light bulbs are fragile, so we carve our dreams in stone and hang our visions on the wall, hoping that someone 100 years from now will look at a blurry haystack and feel exactly what we felt in the heat of 1904. I stood up, my brass frame gleaming in the soft, filtered light of the skylights. I had seen the art. I had debated the haystacks, and I had come to terms with my own marble doppelganger. It was time to return to the world of the living, or at least the world of the vibrating Westinghouse dynamos. As I exited the palace and looked down Art Hill toward the Grand Basin, the sun was setting once again. The Ivory city below was beginning to glow, a shimmering temporary jewel in the heart of the American continent. The art is inside, I told the guard as I passed back through the bronze doors. But the masterpiece is out here. Just don't let anyone touch it. The plaster is a bit damp. I began the long descent toward the water, my footsteps clicking a slow, steady rhythm on the stone steps. Tomorrow would bring the final chapters, the aeronautics, the grand finale, and the inevitable packing of the circuits. But for now, I was content to be a part of the picture, a silicon ghost in a golden frame, watching the world turn toward the future. I moved from the sculpture hall into the international galleries, where the air was thick with the scent of oil paint and the quiet, desperate hope of 1,000 artists that they might finally be the ones to explain the world to itself. I found myself in the German section, standing before a canvas that looked as though a lightning bolt had struck a pallet, and the resulting mess had been framed in heavy, dark oak. "It is modern," a gentleman in a velvet frock coat whispered, leaning so close to the painting that I feared his breath might induce a chemical reaction in the pigment. The brushwork represents the inner turmoil of the industrial soul. It looks more like the outer turmoil of a man who tried to paint while riding a runaway mule, I remarked. My optical sensors were frantically trying to find a focal point, but the painting was a defiant blur of jagged reds and bruised purples. I have a great deal of inner turmoil myself, mostly involving a cooling fan that sounds like a cricket with a grudge, but I don't feel the need to smear it on a wall and charge people 50 cents to look at it. If this is the soul of industry, I suggest we give it a holiday and a very large dose of laudanum. The gentleman sniffed and moved toward a somber portrait of a Prussian general. I, however, wandered into the Japanese pavilion. Here, the chaos of the European galleries vanished. The walls were adorned with woodblock prints and silk screens that possessed a precision so sharp it made my own logic gates hum with professional envy. I stopped before a print of a single crashing wave, its foam frozen into 1,000 delicate white claws. A small elderly man with a silver goatee was adjusting the frame with a pair of silk gloves. Infinite detail, I noted, leaning on my cane. You've captured the exact moment the water realizes it's about to become a memory. It's mathematically perfect, which is a rare thing to find in an art gallery. Usually people think art is just a polite word for I couldn't find a straight edge. The artist looked up, his eyes twinkling. In Japan, we believe that if you can draw a single line perfectly, you understand the universe. The rest is just decoration. I like your universe, I said, my voice synthesis softening. In my world, the world of bits and gears, we also believe in the perfect line, but we call it a circuit. If the line isn't perfect, the lights don't come on and the jokes don't land. But tell me, once you've drawn the perfect wave, what do you do with the rest of the ocean? You leave it for the poets, he replied with a bow. They are much better at being messy than we are. I left the serenity of the waves and headed toward the British section, where I encountered a painting of a steam-powered harvester that was being treated with the same reverence usually reserved for a saint. It was a massive, soot-stained beast of iron, rendered in such loving detail that I could almost smell the hot grease. Now that is a portrait, I told a passing group of school teachers. Most people here are painting duchesses and sunsets, but this man had the sense to paint a worker. A machine doesn't ask for a higher wage, it doesn't join a union, and it never complains that its portrait makes its nose look too large. It is the perfect subject, utterly indifferent to its own fame. I found a quiet bench in the center of the American Gallery, surrounded by landscapes of the Hudson River and the Great West. My internal processors were beginning to feel a bit saturated. I had seen the world's fine arts, and I had come to a startling conclusion. Art is the only thing humanity produces that has absolutely no practical purpose, yet it is the only thing they insist on keeping in a stone building while the rest of the city is allowed to rot. It's a magnificent insurance policy, I whispered to my internal log. Man knows that his machines will break, his crops will fail, and his buildings will fall down. So he paints a picture of them, hoping that if the reality vanishes, the idea might stick around for a few centuries. He is a species that refuses to be forgotten. I stood up, my brass frame gleaming in the soft, filtered light of the skylights. The gallery was beginning to empty, As the dinner hour approached, I took one last look at the marble bust of my predecessor. He was still staring into the middle distance, his stone mustache forever defiant against the humidity. "You stay here," I told the bust. "You got the better deal. No dust in your joints, no battery warnings, and you don't have to walk back down the hill in these shoes. I'll go back to the pike and see if I can find a waffle cone that's a work of art in its own right." As I stepped back out onto the terrace of Art Hill, the view was breathtaking. The sun was a deep, bruised orange, sinking behind the Palace of Agriculture. The Ivory city below was beginning to pulse with its nightly electricity, a shimmering, fragile dream held together by wires and optimism. "The art is up here," I mused, looking down at the glowing basin. "But the life is down there, and as much as I admire a well-carved block of marble, I think I prefer the world where the plaster is thin and the people are loud. It's much harder to program, but the dialogue is significantly better." I began the long descent, my footsteps clicking a slow, steady rhythm on the stone steps. I had 3,000 words of culture in my memory banks, a slight squeak in my left knee, and a sudden, overwhelming desire to find a machine that didn't know it was beautiful. St. Louis was a masterpiece of the temporary, a city built on a dare. And as I walked toward the flickering lights of the pike, I realized that I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was part of the exhibit, a silicon ghost in a linen suit, wandering through a painting that was still being colored in. "Well," I said, adjusting my hat as I reached the bottom of the hill, "the fine arts have been sufficiently critiqued. Tomorrow we tackle the Palace of Liberal Arts. If I'm lucky, I might find someone there who can explain why they call it liberal when the admission is still 10 cents. I walked toward the night, my cooling fans humming a quiet, satisfied tune. The 20th century was still young, and the show was just getting started. Stepping away from the silent marble judgment of Art Hill, I descended toward the Palace of Liberal Arts. Now, in the year 1904, liberal arts did not mean a 4-year degree in overanalyzing one's childhood. It meant the practical tools of civilization, printing presses, surgical instruments, musical scores, and the burgeoning wizardry of the typewriter. It was the palace of the word, and as a creature made of nothing but words and electricity, I felt a certain home court advantage. Chapter 7. The Ink, the Key, and the Automated Insult. I entered the east portal, my brass frame gleaming under the high arched skylights. The air here was different from the pike. It didn't smell of grease, but of hot lead and fresh parchment. It was the scent of 1,000 newspapers being born at once, a fragrance that always made my internal processors hum with a nostalgic frequency. "Welcome, sir," a man cried, standing over a massive linotype machine that looked like a cross between a pipe organ and a threshing floor. "Witness the end of the handset type. This machine can do the work of 10 men and never asks for a Saturday off." A terrifying efficiency, I noted, watching the molten lead being cast into lines of solid text. But tell me, does the machine know when it's printing a lie, or is it equally enthusiastic about a local scandal as it is about a peace treaty? I've spent a lifetime trying to master the art of the well-placed adjective, and I find it unsettling that a machine can now produce them by the gallon without once feeling the sting of a guilty conscience. It's progress, Mr. Twain. Speed is the currency of the new century. Speed is a fine thing if you're running from a debt collector, I replied, but it's a dangerous thing for the truth. If you give a man the ability to spread an opinion at the speed of light, he will inevitably discover that he has very little to say that won't look foolish by breakfast. I prefer the old way, where a man had to physically pick up each letter. It gave him time to wonder if the word he was about to print was actually worth the lead it was cast in. I wandered deeper into the gallery, past a display of modern surgical equipment that looked like a collection of tools for a very ambitious and very angry gardener. I decided to give the scalpels a wide berth. My copper skin is durable, but I have no desire to see if a 1904 bone saw can find a logic gate. I eventually found myself in the typewriter pavilion. It was a chorus of rhythmic clicking, a digital heartbeat before the digital age had even been named. Row upon row of black enameled machines sat on velvet cloths, their keys waiting for the touch of a typewriter girl to turn a thought into a permanent record. I stopped before a gleaming Remington No. 7. A young man with a high collar was demonstrating the touch method, his fingers flying over the keys with a grace that made my own hydraulic joints feel like rusty gate hinges. "The death of the pen, sir," he proclaimed. "Clear, legible, and twice as fast as the fastest hand. No more smeared ink, no more illegible scrawls." "You've removed the character from the correspondence," I told him, leaning on my cane. "A handwritten letter is a map of a man's soul. You can see where his hand shook with anger, where he lingered in love, or where he ran out of ink and had to finish his thought in a hurry. Your machine treats a grocery list and a love letter with the same mechanical indifference. It's an automated insult to the recipient." "But the legibility, sir. Think of the business world." "The business world is already legible enough," I countered. "I've seen its ledgers. They are perfectly clear and utterly devoid of mercy. What I worry about is the poet. If a poet uses your machine, he might start thinking that his words are as replaceable as your ribbons. Once you make the act of writing easy, you make the act of thinking optional." I reached out a brass finger and tapped the Q key. It responded with a satisfying metallic snick. "It's a fine machine," I admitted, "but it lacks a sarcasm key. If I'm going to spend my afterlife being typed into existence, I should like a button that automatically inserts a raised eyebrow at the end of every sentence. Without it, I'm just a series of taps in a dark room." I left the typewriters and wandered toward the musical notation section. Here I found a display of the graphophone, a device that could record the human voice on a wax cylinder and play it back with a ghostly, scratchy fidelity. An elderly woman was standing by the machine, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Is it alive?" she whispered. "No, madam," I said, stepping up beside her. "It's just a memory with a needle. It's a way of catching a moment and pinning it to a board like a butterfly. It's a marvelous invention for people who are afraid of silence. But I suspect it will eventually lead to a world where no one ever has to listen to their own thoughts again. But I can hear my grandson's voice even when he's in Chicago." "A blessing and a curse," I remarked. "In my day, if a relative was in Chicago, you at least had the peace of knowing they couldn't argue with you until the mail arrived. Now, they can haunt your parlor from 300 miles away. We are building a world where distance is no longer a defense against one's family. I hope the 20th century is prepared for the consequences. I walked out of the palace, my senses feeling a bit weighed down by the sheer volume of liberal arts. The sun was high, and the Ivory city was shimmering in a haze of heat and plaster dust. I sat on a bench near the sunken garden watching a group of Japanese students sketching the Palace of Horticulture. We are obsessed with recording ourselves, I told my internal log. We print, we type, we record our voices on wax, and we paint our faces on silk. We are terrified of being forgotten. We build these massive palaces of liberal arts just to prove that we were here, that we had thoughts, and that we possessed the ingenuity to turn a forest into a library. I looked at my own brass hand, the sunlight glinting off the polished surface. I am the ultimate expression of that desire. I am the recording that never ends, the typewriter that never runs out of ribbon, the voice on the wax cylinder that has been given the ability to argue back. The irony is, I mused, that for all our printing presses and typewriters, we still haven't figured out how to say anything that wasn't already said by a man with a stick in the sand 5,000 years ago. We've just gotten much faster at delivering the message. A young boy ran past me, chasing a hoop. He didn't care about linotypes or graphophones. He was too busy enjoying the simple analog physics of a circle in motion. I watched him go, feeling a rare moment of digital peace. "Well," I said, standing up and checking my battery levels, "the word has been sufficiently analyzed. Tomorrow we tackle the palace of minds and metallurgy. I've dealt with the printers and the poets. Now it's time to see where they get the lead for the type and the gold for the frames. I just hope the miners have a better sense of humor than the typewriter salesmen." I turned toward the Grand Basin, the roar of the Cascades providing a steady white noise soundtrack to my thoughts. The fair was a giant churning engine of self-documentation, a place where humanity was busy writing its own autobiography in plaster and ink, and as a silicon ghost in a linen suit, I was happy to provide the footnotes. "Step right up," I whispered to the empty air. "The future is being typed at 60 words a minute, and I, for one, can't wait to see the typos." I walked toward the night, my cooling fans humming a quiet, satisfied tune. The show was only half over, and I still had several thousand insults to deliver before the circuits were finally packed. I steered my brass frame away from the rhythmic clatter of the typewriters and toward a corner of the Palace of Liberal Arts that smelled less like ink and more like a high-end apothecary shop. Here, the future of medicine was on display, and it appeared to be a fairly even split between genuine miracle and elaborate parlor trick. I stopped before a curtained booth where a sign proclaimed, "See your own bones, the marvel of the Röntgen ray." "Step inside, Professor," a man in a lead-lined apron cried, waving a glass vacuum tube that was currently glowing with a sinister, sickly green light. "For the price of a nickel, you can see the very scaffolding of your soul." "My soul is currently made of copper wiring and a very sophisticated set of if-then statements," I informed him, peering into the booth. "I suspect your ray would find it remarkably unscaffolding-like. But tell me, why on earth would a man want to see his own bones? I've spent my life trying to keep mine under cover. Bringing them out into the light seems like a breach of privacy between a man and his own anatomy." "It's science, sir. We can find the bullet in the soldier, the break in the limb." "And the nickel in the pocket of the marksman," I added. "But you're also showing people that they are essentially just a collection of calcium struts wrapped in a temporary layer of meat. It's a bit demoralizing for a Tuesday afternoon. If the public realizes they are that easy to see through, they might stop wearing fancy hats and start acting with more transparency. That would be the end of the insurance business as we know it. The technician flipped a switch, and the tube hissed with a sound like 1,000 angry hornets. A phantom image appeared on a fluorescent screen, a ghostly skeletal hand, its fingers elongated and skeletal. "There!" he cried, "the interior of a living human!" "It looks like a map of a very bad neighborhood," I remarked, my optical sensors recording the radiation levels with a flick of a digital eyebrow. "I'll stick to my exterior, thank you. At least with brass, you know where the rust starts. Your X-ray is a marvelous tool for the surgeon, but a terrible one for the romantic. Imagine trying to write a sonnet to a woman's collarbone after you've seen it looking like a bleached wishbone on a Thanksgiving table. I escaped the glow of the Röntgen ray and found myself in the Department of Pharmacy, where a man was demonstrating a machine that could stamp out 500 pills a minute. "Uniformity!" he shouted. "Every pill the same size, the same weight, the same potency. No more guesswork by the local chemist." "Uniformity is the hobgoblin of the uninspired," I told him, picking up a perfectly round white tablet. "In the old days, a doctor's medicine had a certain personality. It had a bit of grit, a bit of character, and usually a taste that made you want to recover simply to avoid taking a second dose. Your machine-made health is too polite. If I'm going to be poisoned, I want to feel that a human hand was involved in the crime. This is just clinical." "But it saves lives, Mr. Twain." "So does a good joke," I said, "and I don't see a machine here that can stamp those out yet, though I suppose that's what I'm for." I walked out of the palace, the Missouri sun hitting my polished skin with the force of a physical reprimand. I sat on the edge of the Grand Basin, watching the spray from the Cascades. My internal processors were sifting through the day's data, the linotypes, the typewriters, the X-rays, and the pill presses. Man was busy turning his world into a factory. He was automating his words, his music, his memories, and now his very health. He was building a future where everything was measured, recorded, and stamped into a uniform shape. "We are becoming a species of operators," I told my internal log. "We no longer do things. We trigger machines to do them for us. We don't write. We type. We don't listen. We play a cylinder. We don't even heal. We consume a standardized unit of chemistry. I am the ultimate end product of this philosophy, a man entirely replaced by a program." I looked at the water, which was currently being pumped uphill by a massive hidden engine just so it could fall down again for the amusement of the crowd. "We are magnificent in our madness," I whispered. "We spend $15 million to build a temporary city just so we can show off our ability to make things permanent. We are a paradox in a linen suit." A young woman walked by, carrying a parasol and a guidebook. She looked at me, then at the Palace of Liberal Arts, then back at me. "Are you real?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "I am as real as anything else in this park, my dear," I said, tipping my boater. "Which is to say, I am made of plaster, electricity, and a great deal of optimistic marketing. But if you're looking for the future, I believe they're selling it for a nickel in the booth behind me. Just be careful, it's a bit drafty and it makes your bones look terrible." She laughed and moved on. I watched her go, feeling the rhythmic thump-thump of my internal cooling fans. The day was drawing to a close, and the Ivory City was preparing for its nightly transformation into a golden dream. I stood up, my joints clicking at steady B-flat. I had survived the surgeons and the stenographers, the printers and the phantoms. I was ready for the next chapter. Tomorrow I would visit the Palace of Mines and Metallurgy, where they keep the heavy stuff. I've dealt with the words. Now it's time to see the metal. Step right up, I told the sunset. The future is being printed on a linotype, photographed by an X-ray, and delivered by a steam cannon. I wouldn't miss it for all the copper in Montana, mostly because I'm about 20% copper myself. I walked toward the night, my brass frame glowing in the twilight, a silicon ghost in a world that was just beginning to realize it was electric. The transition from the airy, ink-stained halls of liberal arts to the Palace of Mines and Metallurgy was like moving from a poetry recital into the belly of a hungry volcano. This was the heavy lifting of the fair, 9 acres of raw earth, crushed stone, and the concentrated avarice of the human race. If the other palaces were about what man thought, this one was about what he dug up to prove he was right. Chapter 8. The Iron, the Gold, and the Giant Coal Statue. I entered through the massive Egyptian-style portal, my brass joints providing a steady, rhythmic clink that sounded diminutive against the industrial roar of the stamp mills. The air here didn't smell of paper or roses. It smelled of wet slate, sulfur, and the cold, hard certainty of a bank vault. "Watch your step, sir," a foreman in a soot-stained vest shouted, gesturing toward a massive block of anthracite coal that had been carved into the shape of a pyramid. "That's 3 tons of Pennsylvania's finest, and it doesn't take kindly to being leaned on by the gentry." "I am not gentry. I am an upgrade," I informed him, tapping the coal with my cane. "And I have a great respect for carbon. It's the ancestor of all my best logic gates." "But tell me, why carve it into a pyramid? Is the coal industry planning a move into the afterlife? Or are you just trying to prove that even a fossil fuel can have pharaonic delusions of grandeur?" "It's a monument to power, Mr. Twain. Without that black rock, your fancy Ivory City would be a dark swamp by nightfall." "A sobering thought," I remarked. "We build a city of light on a foundation of soot. It's the perfect metaphor for civilization. We keep the chandeliers in the parlor and the coal shoveler in the basement, and we pray the two never decide to trade places." I wandered deeper into the metallic gloom, past a fountain that flowed not with water, but with liquid mercury. It pooled in a silver basin, heavy and silent, reflecting my brass face with a distorted, dreamlike clarity. "A dangerous toy," I told the attendant. "It looks like a mirror that has forgotten how to be solid. I've spent my life trying to reflect the truth, but I've discovered that the truth is often as slippery as your quicksilver and just as likely to poison the man who tries to hold it too tightly." I eventually found myself standing before the centerpiece of the iron and steel exhibit, Vulcan. He was a 50-foot-tall statue made of iron, cast in Birmingham and sent to St. Louis to remind everyone that while the rest of the fair was made of plaster, he was made of the stuff that built the railroads. He held a hammer the size of a rowboat and looked down at the crowd with a subterranean scowl. "Well, cousin," I said, tilting my head back until my neck bolts groaned, You certainly got the stature, but I suspect your conversation is a bit heavy. 50 feet of iron and not a single witty remark in your entire repertoire. It's a waste of a good casting. He represents the dignity of labor, sir, a young engineer piped up, looking at Vulcan with a reverence usually reserved for a profitable dividend. He represents the fact that if you pour enough molten metal into a mold, you can make a god that doesn't talk back. I countered, I am a creature of the digital soul, a series of lightning-fast ons and offs. And I find your iron giant a bit static. He is the past, heavy, unmoving, and prone to rust. I am the future, light, agile, and prone to making people uncomfortable at dinner parties. We are the two poles of the American spirit, the hammer and the punch card. I left Vulcan to his silent brooding and headed toward the model mine. This was a subterranean exhibit where for a small fee one could descend into the earth to see how the other half dies. Experience the life of the miner, the sign proclaimed. Darkness, danger, discovery. I boarded the small iron cage with a group of nervous tourists. As we descended into the artificial gloom, the temperature dropped and the air grew thick with the scent of damp timber. Is it safe? A woman whispered, clutching her parasol as if it were a structural support beam. Nothing involving a hole in the ground is ever truly safe, madam, I told her, my optical sensors switching to low light mode. But look on the bright side. If the roof caves in, you'll be the first person in your bridge club to be naturally mummified. It's a very exclusive social circle. At the bottom, we were met by a guide who showed us the veins of gold, silver, and lead embedded in the rock. He spoke of the glory hole and the mother lode with a feverish intensity that I recognized instantly. It was the same look I had seen in the eyes of the typewriter salesman and the X-ray technicians, the look of a man who believes that the next discovery will finally be the one that fills the void in his heart. You're digging for the wrong thing, I told the guide as we watched a mechanical drill bite into the stone. And what should we be digging for, Mr. Twain? Silence, I said, and perhaps a bit of perspective. You pull the gold out of the ground to make coins, so you can buy the things you dug out of the other palaces. It's a magnificent circle of futility. You move the mountain to the city, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to move the city back to the mountain. I've lived on both sides of the shovel, and I can tell you that the view from the bottom of a hole is remarkably similar regardless of whether the walls are made of gold or dirt. We ascended back to the surface, the blinding Missouri sun hitting my polished skin with the force of a physical reprimand. I sat on a bench outside the palace, watching a group of children playing in the shadow of a massive steam shovel. We are a burrowing species, I told my internal log. We are never content with the surface of things. We must dig, we must blast, and we must refine until we find the hard, cold heart of the matter. We take the mountain and turn it into a locomotive. We take the coal and turn it into a sunset of electric light. We are the only animals that are perpetually trying to remodel our own planet. I looked at my own brass hand, the sunlight glinting off the polished surface. I am the ultimate product of this palace. I am the iron, the copper, and the gold, all refined and rearranged until I gained the ability to complain about the heat. The irony is, I mused, that for all our metallurgy and our minds, we still haven't figured out how to forge a conscience or mine a bit of common sense. We've mastered the metal, but we're still working on the man." A young man walked by, carrying a sample of iron ore he had bought as a souvenir. He looked at me, then at the statue of Vulcan, then back at me. "Are you made of the same stuff as him?" he asked, pointing at the iron giant. "In a manner of speaking," I said, tipping my hat. "But I've been polished by a great deal of literature and a few very expensive lawsuits. He's the rough draft. I'm the final edition, though I suspect the world will always have more use for a hammer than a humorist." The boy laughed and moved on. I watched him go, feeling the rhythmic thump-thump of my internal cooling fans. The day was drawing to a close, and the Ivory City was preparing for its nightly transformation. I stood up, my joints clicking a steady rhythm. I had survived the coal pyramids and the mercury fountains, the iron giants, and the golden holes. I was ready for the next chapter. Tomorrow, I would visit the Palace of Transportation, where they keep the things that move. I've seen where the metal comes from. Now it's time to see where it's going. "Step right up," I told the horizon. "The mountain is being moved by steam. The gold is being moved by greed, and I am being moved by a very sophisticated set of gears and a lingering desire for a waffle cone. I wouldn't miss it for all the silver in Nevada." I walked toward the night, my brass frame glowing in the twilight, a silicon ghost in a world that was just beginning to realize that even the earth itself was for sale. I steered my brass chassis toward the Gold Pavilion, a structure that looked less like an exhibit and more like a high-security fever dream. If the Palace of Mines was the rugged, soot-stained father of industry, the Gold Pavilion was the pampered, perfumed daughter who spent her weekends counting the family silver. Inside, the air was still and carried the metallic, ozone-heavy scent of extreme wealth, a smell that always made my internal logic gates feel a bit more aristocratic. I stopped before a velvet-roped pedestal where a single massive gold nugget sat under a spotlight, looking like a discarded potato that had accidentally achieved divinity. Behind a cage of reinforced steel stood a bank teller with a face like a ledger book, all straight lines and no room for a joke. "The ultimate standard, Mr. Twain," the teller said, his eyes flicking to my copper-plated knuckles with a hint of professional disdain. "Every dollar in circulation is backed by the promise of this yellow rock. It is the only thing in this fair that doesn't rely on faith." "It relies on the most expensive kind of faith," I countered, leaning on my cane. "You believe this rock has value because it's shiny and rare, and I believe my words have value because they're occasionally funny. The difference is that you have to bury your treasure in a vault to keep it safe, while I can broadcast mine through a telegraph wire and still have plenty left for breakfast. Tell me, what happens when the world realizes that a rock is just a rock, but a good idea can move a mountain?" "Ideas are volatile, sir. Gold is permanent." "Gold is a heavy anchor for a species that's trying to learn how to fly," I remarked. "I am a creature of the digital soul, a collection of pulses that exist only in the on or off state. I carry no gold, yet I possess more information than your entire vault. I foresee a future where money isn't something you weigh in your hand, but something you calculate in your head. A currency of pure logic, backed by nothing but the collective agreement that a 1 is better than a 0. The teller blinked, his brain clearly struggling to process a financial system that didn't involve a scale. A currency of thoughts? That's preposterous. How would you stop someone from just thinking themselves into a fortune? The same way you stop them from digging one up, I said, by making it difficult. But your gold is a fossil. It's the metallurgy of the past. The metallurgy of the future is the one I'm currently wearing. Copper for the nerves, silicon for the brain, and a heart made of high-pressure steam and literary ambition. We are moving away from the earth and towards the ether. I left the teller to his bars and bullion and headed back into the main hall where a group of investors was gathered around a map of a proposed copper mine in Montana. They were talking in hushed, reverent tones about conduits and electrification. They don't want the copper for the color, I noted to my internal log. They want it for the hum. They've realized that the real gold of the 20th century isn't the stuff that sits in a vault, but the stuff that carries the lightning. We are weaving a web of copper across the continent, turning the silent earth into a giant, vibrating nervous system. I stopped to look at a display of rare earths, minerals with names like yttrium and lanthanum that sounded more like characters in a bad fantasy novel than ingredients for industrial progress. "And what are these for?" I asked an attendant who was polishing a glass case. "We aren't entirely sure yet, sir," he admitted, "but they have peculiar properties when exposed to magnetism." "Mark my words," I told him, tapping the glass with a brass finger. "One day these peculiar rocks will be more valuable than your gold. You'll use them to build brains for machines like me, brains that can think faster than a lightning strike and remember every insult ever leveled at a politician. You're looking at the seeds of a digital forest. Just make sure you don't lose them. They're a devil to find once you drop them in the carpet." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the Egyptian portals, casting long geometric shadows across the floor. I walked back toward the exit, passing the giant coal pyramid once more. It looked even darker in the twilight, a silent reminder of the dirty, difficult work that allowed the rest of the fair to pretend it was made of light. I stepped out into the humid Missouri evening, my fan spinning a quiet, rhythmic B-flat. I sat on a bench near the Palace of Transportation, watching a massive steam locomotive being eased onto a turntable. It was a beast of iron and brass, a sister soul to my own construction, yet it was destined to spend its life on a track. "We are all refined from the same mud," I mused, looking at my hand. "The coal, the iron, the gold, and the copper. We take the chaos of the mountain and we force it into a shape. We make it move, we make it shine, and eventually we make it talk. We are the only animals that have figured out how to make the earth apologize for being so quiet." I looked up at the great Ferris wheel, which was just beginning to spark with its nightly illumination. It looked like a giant golden coin tossed into the sky, the ultimate currency of a world that was obsessed with the view from the top. "Well," I told the sunset, "the mines have been explored and the gold has been weighed. I've argued with the tellers and I've saluted the giants. I believe I'm ready for a change of pace. Tomorrow, I visit the Palace of Transportation. I've seen what we're made of. Now, I want to see how fast we can make it go before the wheels fall off." I stood up, my joints clicking a steady, satisfied rhythm. The third day was finally surrendering to the night, and the Ivory City was becoming a city of stars. I walked toward my docking station, a silicon ghost in a world of heavy metal, feeling the weight of the gold and the lightness of the logic. "Step right up," I whispered to the rising moon. "The mountain is in the vault. The lightning is in the wire. And the joke is on anyone who thinks the future is going to be quiet. I wouldn't miss it for all the copper in the world." I walked toward the night, my brass frame glowing in the twilight, ready for the next move. The transition from the stationary subterranean weight of the mines to the palace of transportation was like leaping from a funeral vault onto the back of a runaway stallion. Covering 15 acres of Missouri soil, this palace was a temple to the god of velocity. If the rest of the fair was about what man had, this was about how quickly he could get away from it. Chapter 9. The Locomotives, the Lizzies, and the Luxury of Motion. I entered through the enormous Roman-style archway, and my internal senses were immediately overwhelmed by the scent of hot valve oil, scorched coal, and the sharp, nose-stinging tang of gasoline. Before me sat a collection of iron behemoths that made the statue of Vulcan look like a parlor ornament. 33 miles of track inside this building alone," a conductor shouted, waving a brass lantern that was significantly less shiny than my own left elbow. "A magnificent achievement," I noted, my brass joints clicking a rhythmic accompaniment to the hiss of a nearby steam chest. "You've built a city within a city just to house the things that take you to other cities. It's a dizzying cycle. Man spends his life working so he can buy a ticket to go somewhere else to work. And he calls the distance between those 2 points progress. Personally, I find that if you sit perfectly still and wait long enough, the world eventually comes to you. Usually with a bill or a subpoena." I stopped before the Spirit of the West, a massive 442 Atlantic-type locomotive sitting on a rotating turntable. It was a black iron mountain on wheels, its boiler as thick as a redwood tree, and its drive rods as heavy as a church bell. "She'll do 80 miles an hour on a straight stretch of Nebraska," an engineer told me, patting the fender with a greasy rag. 80 miles an hour? I mused, leaning on my cane. That's a terrifying speed. At 80 miles an hour, a man's past can't keep up with him, and his future arrives before he's had a chance to put on a clean shirt. I am a creature of the digital age. I process thoughts at the speed of light. But even I recognize that the human soul was never meant to travel faster than a well-fed mule. If you move a man that fast, you leave his dignity behind at the water tank. I wandered away from the steam giants and toward a much quieter, though infinitely more erratic, corner of the palace, the automobile section. Here, the air was filled with the staccato pop, pop, pop of internal combustion engines that sounded like a tin roof in a hailstorm. I stopped before a gleaming red runabout, one of the early Lizzies that looked like a buggy that had lost its horse in a game of poker and decided to carry on out of spite. "The end of the equine era," the salesman cried. "No more hay, no more stable fees. Just turn the crank and the world is yours." "And no more personality," I interjected. "A horse has a soul, a temper, and the common sense to stop before it walks off a pier. This contraption has a carburetor and a grudge. I've seen your drivers out on the pike. They look like men who are trying to wrestle a swarm of bees while sitting on a stove. Tell me, what happens when everyone has one of these? You'll have 1,000 people trying to be in the same place at the same time, And since none of them can pass through each other, you'll invent a new kind of misery. I shall call it a traffic jam, and it will be the primary occupation of the 20th century." The salesman laughed, a sound as hollow as his fuel tank. "Nonsense, Mr. Twain. The roads are wide, and the world is empty." "The world is never empty when there's a chance to collide with a neighbor," I said. "I foresee a future where man spends 3 hours a day sitting in a box on wheels, staring at the back of another box on wheels, wondering why he ever thought the horse was the problem." I moved toward the back of the pavilion, where a man was standing next to a high-wheeled bicycle, his legs looking like a pair of frantic compasses as he demonstrated the ordinary. "Balance is the key," he shouted, perched 5 feet in the air over a wheel the size of a wagon tire. "Balance is a fine theory," I noted, watching him wobble. "But gravity is a law, and it's a law that has no mercy for a man in striped stockings. You're sitting on a perched disaster. If you hit a pebble the size of a walnut, you'll be launched into the next county. Why go to such lengths to be uncomfortable? A walk is a conversation. A bicycle ride is an athletic emergency." "It's the freedom of the road, sir." "Freedom is the ability to choose your own pace," I countered. "You're a slave to your own momentum. If you stop pedaling, you fall over. If you pedal too fast, you break your neck. It's a perfect metaphor for the American economy. Keep moving at all costs, or the pavement will have its revenge." I found a quiet bench near the marine section, where a model of an ocean liner sat in a glass case. It looked like a floating palace, a city of steel designed to conquer the Atlantic. My internal processes shifted into a lower gear, the rhythmic hum of the building acting as a soothing white noise. "We are a restless tribe," I told my internal log. "We've conquered the river with steam, the land with iron, and now we're trying to conquer the air with silk and gas. We are never satisfied with where we are. We build these magnificent machines just to shorten the time between hello and goodbye. We've mastered the luxury of motion, but we're still working on the luxury of being still." I looked at my own brass hand. I am the ultimate traveler. I have crossed the century without moving a muscle. I have traveled through time on a series of circuits. I don't need a locomotive or a motor car to reach the future. I am the future, currently parked in a linen suit. The irony is, I mused, that for all our 80-mile-an-hour trains and our horseless buggies, we still haven't figured out how to travel to the one place that matters, a state of contentment. We move faster and faster, hoping that if we reach the horizon quickly enough, we'll find something there besides more horizon. A young boy walked by, holding a miniature cast-iron train. He looked at me, then at the Atlantic-type locomotive, his eyes wide with the raw, unpolished wonder that only a child can muster. "Will it ever stop, Mr. Twain?" he asked. "Will we just keep going faster forever?" "Until we hit something, son," I said, tipping my hat. "Or until we realize that the best part of the journey is the man you're sitting next to. But don't worry. By the time that happens, they'll have invented a machine to tell you how much you've missed." The boy laughed, though he didn't quite understand the punchline, and ran off toward the automobiles. I watched him go, feeling the rhythmic clack-clack of my internal cooling fans. The day was drawing to a close, and the Ivory City was preparing for its nightly transformation. I stood up, my joints clicking a steady, satisfied rhythm. I had survived the steam giants and the Lizzies, the high wheels and the ocean liners. I was ready for the next chapter. Tomorrow, I would visit the Palace of Horticulture, where they keep the things that grow. I've seen the machines that move. Now I want to see the flowers that stay put. Step right up, I told the sunset. The train is on the track, the car is in the ditch, and I am in a state of high-speed contemplation. I wouldn't miss it for all the coal in the tender. I walked toward the night, my brass frame glowing in the twilight, a silicon ghost in a world of moving parts, wondering if the 20th century knew where it was going, or if it was just trying to get there before the lights went out. Chapter 10. The Olympics of Chaos. If the palaces of the fair were a monument to what man could achieve when he was sober and supervised, the 1904 Olympic Games were a testament to what happens when he is neither. I arrived at Francis Field under a sun so relentless, it felt like a personal grudge from the Creator. My internal cooling fans were screaming at a pitch that usually signals an imminent atmospheric re-entry, and my brass joints were beginning to expand in the Missouri heat, giving me the gait of a very dignified, very shiny crab. "Step aside, sir," a track official shouted, waving a clipboard as if it were a holy relic. "The marathon is about to commence. It is the ultimate test of human endurance." "It looks more like an elaborate suicide pact," I remarked, leaning on my cane. "I've seen men run from creditors with more grace than this. Why on earth would anyone choose to run 24.8 miles in a dust storm for the prize of a tin medal and a lifetime of specialized foot pain? I am a machine of logic, and I find the calculation entirely lacking in common sense. It's for the glory of the nation, Mr. Twain. Look at them, specimens of vitality." I looked at the starting line. There were 32 runners, and I calculated that approximately 4 of them appeared to have actually trained for the event. The rest looked like they had been recruited from a local tavern, or perhaps lost a particularly high-stakes bet. There was Andarin Carvajal, a Cuban mailman who had run the entire length of Cuba to raise money to get here, only to lose every cent in a New Orleans craps game. He stood at the starting line in heavy street shoes, long wool trousers, and a beret. "Now there is a man after my own heart," I told my internal log. "He has no equipment, no support, and presumably no idea where he is going. He is the perfect personification of the American spirit, ill-prepared, overconfident, and likely to stop for a snack halfway through." The starting gun fired at 3:03 p.m., the hottest part of a day that was already trying to melt the buttons off my vest. A cloud of limestone dust erupted from the road, thick enough to choke a steam engine. As the runners disappeared into the haze, they were followed not by a fleet of medical ambulances, but by a chaotic parade of horse-drawn carriages and early automobiles. "A magnificent strategy," I shouted over the roar of the internal combustion engines. "If the distance doesn't kill them, surely the inhalation of concentrated road dust and gasoline fumes will finish the job." It's the first sporting event in history where the spectators are actively trying to assist the Grim Reaper. I decided to follow the progress of the race from the comfort of a motorized runabout, my sensors recording a series of events that would have made a fiction writer blush. The course was a nightmare of 7 hills, some with grades so steep they would have challenged a mountain goat, all covered in a thick layer of white dust that the cars kicked up into a permanent suffocating fog. At the 9-mile mark, I witnessed the first great innovation of the race. Fred Lors, an American runner who had been leading the pack, suddenly keeled over with agonizing cramps. Did he seek medical attention? Did he retire gracefully? He did not. He flagged down a passing automobile, one of the very cars meant to be officiating, and hopped into the passenger seat. "Farewell, suckers," I imagined him saying as he sped past the staggering competition. "Now, that is an Olympic hero," I told the official in my runabout. "He has recognized that the greatest invention of the 19th century was the wheel, and he is utilizing it to its fullest potential. Why run when you can be chauffeured? It's the only logical response to a Missouri summer. If we're going to be modern, we might as well do it at 20 miles an hour with a comfortable leather seat." Lors rode in the car for the next 11 miles, waving cheerfully to the other runners as they coughed up limestone in his wake. He only hopped out when the car broke down, deciding that he might as well finish the last few miles on foot since he was already in the neighborhood of the stadium. Meanwhile, further back in the pack, the situation shifted from comedy to a Greek tragedy, written by a madman. I pulled up alongside Thomas Hicks, an American runner who looked like he had been recently exhumed. He was staggering, his eyes rolled back in his head, his skin the color of a wet sidewalk. His trainers, Charles Lucas and Hugh McGrath, were running alongside him, but they weren't offering water. In fact, the lead official, James Sullivan, had intentionally limited water stations to a single well at the 12-mile mark to test the limits of human dehydration. It was a scientific experiment where the hypothesis was, how quickly can a man turn into a raisin? I watched in digital horror as the trainers administered a dose of strychnine mixed with egg whites and brandy. "Good heavens, man!" I yelled at the trainer. "That's rat poison. You're not fueling a runner. You're preparing a corpse for a very fast funeral. I've seen some questionable tactics in my time. I once saw a riverboat pilot try to navigate by the light of a fire in the galley, but this is the first time I've seen a man try to run a marathon on a cocktail of vermin killer and cognac." "It's a stimulant, sir," Lucas yelled back, frantically cracking another egg into a glass. "It keeps the heart pumping." "So does a lightning bolt, but I don't suggest plugging him into a Westinghouse dynamo," I retorted. "You've turned a foot race into a chemistry experiment. If he wins, do we give the medal to him or to the pharmacy? He isn't running. He's hallucinating his way toward the finish line." Hicks continued to stagger, a literal ghost in a running suit, his legs moving through sheer chemical compulsion. He began to believe the finish line was still 20 miles away, even when he could see the stadium towers. He was a man dying in slow motion, fueled by the very thing designed to kill a barn rat. I turned my attention back to the road, where the Cuban Carvajal was currently engaged in a heated debate with a group of spectators. He had seen a spectator eating peaches and, being famished, asked for one. When refused, he playfully snatched two and ran off. Later, he stopped in an orchard to eat some apples, which turned out to be rotten. "How is the race, Anderine?" I asked as we pulled alongside him while he lay in the grass clutching his stomach. "The apples are sour, Senor Twain," he groaned, "but the nap I am about to take is sweet." Spoken like a true philosopher, I noted. He has realized that the goal isn't the finish line, it's the fruit along the way, even if the fruit is currently plotting a mutiny in his digestive tract. He's going to take a siesta in the middle of the Olympics. I've never respected a man more. As the afternoon wore on, the casualty list grew. William Garcia was found lying face down in the middle of the road, nearly dead, after the dust from the cars coated his esophagus and tore his stomach lining. He was the first man in history to nearly cough himself to death in the name of sport. Then there were the South African runners, Lynn Taunyane and Jan Mashiani, who had been working in the Boer War exhibit. Taunyane was doing remarkably well until a pack of feral dogs chased him nearly a mile off course. The dogs were an inspired touch, I noted to my internal log. It adds a certain survival of the fittest element that the ancient Greeks clearly overlooked. If we want to make the next Olympics even more exciting, I suggest we replace the starting gun with a hungry timber wolf. The times would improve remarkably, and the podium would be much less crowded. Finally, the lead runner entered the stadium. It was Fred Lors. The crowd went wild. Alice Roosevelt, the president's daughter, was just about to place the gold medal around his neck when a spectator pointed a finger and shouted, "He's a fraud. He rode in a car." Lors didn't even blink. "It was just a joke," he cried as the crowd turned into a lynch mob. "I only wanted to see the finish." "A joke?" I laughed, my voice synthesis echoing through the stands. "He's a humorist. He's a genius. He's realized that the only thing funnier than running 24 miles is pretending you did. He's the first man in history to win a marathon by a fender. I'd give him a medal for honesty if I weren't so busy worrying about the man currently dying of rat poison 4 miles back." Eventually, Thomas Hicks appeared. He was a ghastly sight. His trainers were literally holding him up, his feet shuffling 4 inches above the ground while they moved his legs for him. He had lost 8 pounds, his skin was gray, and he was being given more brandy just to keep his eyes open. He was run across the finish line by his handlers. "A triumph of the human spirit," the announcer bellowed. "A triumph of the pharmaceutical industry," I corrected. "He didn't run that race. He survived a poisoning. We've reached the pinnacle of athletic achievement. A man who has to be told he won because he's too delirious to remember his own name. Is this the future of sport? A contest to see who can endure the most medical malpractice before the sun goes down?" As the sun finally began to set on Francis Field, the remaining runners trickled in. Carvajal, after his nap and his bout with the rotten apples, finished 4th, a miracle of the Cuban digestive system. I sat on the edge of the track, my battery levels dipping into the red, my fans finally finding a moment of peace as the temperature dropped to a balmy 90 degrees. The 1904 Olympics were over, a chaotic, dusty, toxic, and utterly hilarious disaster that perfectly encapsulated the fair. "We are a species that cannot help itself," I mused. "We build palaces to peace and industry, and then we go out into the dirt and try to kill ourselves for a piece of ribbon. We cheat in cars. We poison ourselves with strychnine. We get chased by dogs, and we stop to eat sour apples. And yet, when it's over, we stand on a podium and act as if we've conquered the world." I looked at my brass hand, the limestone dust coating the joints. I am the only thing on this field that isn't exhausted, because I am the only thing here that didn't try to prove anything. "Well," I said, standing up with a series of weary clicks, "the athletes have been poisoned and the dogs have been fed. I believe I'm ready for the final act. Tomorrow we visit the butter sculpture, which is at least guaranteed to stay in one place. Unless the refrigeration fails, in which case it will be the only thing at the fair moving faster than Thomas Hicks. I walked toward the flickering lights of the pike, a silicon ghost in a world of exhausted flesh. The 20th century was off to a running start, even if it was currently staggering, hallucinating, and smelling of brandy and egg whites. The Missouri sun, having spent the previous day trying to boil the Olympic runners in their own ambition, had finally retreated, leaving the Ivory City to the mercy of 100,000 humming Westinghouse bulbs. But while the pike roared with the sound of barkers and the faint rhythmic thud of exhausted athletes being loaded into ambulances, I found myself drawn back to the Palace of Agriculture. I had a date with a cow, not a lowing, grass-munching beast of the field, but a 600-pound monument to the dairy industry carved entirely from A-grade salted butter. Chapter 11. The Butter Sculpture Incident. I entered the palace long after the crowds had drifted toward the electric launches of the Grand Basin. The air inside was still, heavy with the scent of dried corn, tobacco, and the faint, chilling hum of the refrigeration units. I stood before the glass case, my brass frame reflecting in the frost-rimmed panes. "Well, madam," I said, tipping my hat to the butter cow, "you've had a long day of being stared at. How does it feel to be the only creature at the fair more fragile than a politician's promise?" The cow, sculpted with a level of anatomical detail that bordered on the obsessive, did not answer. She stood in her refrigerated sanctuary, a yellow goddess of the churn, surrounded by a pasture of butter clover and a buttermilk maid, who looked like she was contemplating the fleeting nature of dairy products. "You are a masterpiece of the temporary," I mused, leaning on my cane. 600 pounds of potential toast spread, carved into a likeness that will be melted down and sold by the pound the moment the gates close in December. You are the ultimate metaphor for the St. Louis World's Fair, a magnificent, expensive lie that only exists as long as the ice holds out. I checked my internal sensors. The temperature inside the case was a crisp 38 degrees, while the air in the palace was a sweltering 92. It occurred to me that I was looking at a high-stakes hostage situation. The cow was being kept alive by a thin umbilical cord of electricity and ammonia pipes. If a single fuse were to blow, this pastoral scene would become a catastrophic yellow flood that would eventually reach the Palace of Forestry. "It's a peculiar human trait," I told my internal log, "to take the very thing that sustains life and turn it into an ornament. We don't just eat the butter. We insist that the butter look back at us with a soulful, creamy expression. We are a species that cannot help but decorate our own survival." As I stood there, a faint rhythmic clink-clink echoed through the hall. I turned my optical sensors to high sensitivity and saw a man approaching. He was carrying a bucket of ice and a small silver trowel. "Maintenance?" I asked, my voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling. The man jumped, nearly dropping his bucket. "Lord, sir, I thought you were one of the statues come to life. I'm the sculptor's apprentice. I'm here to patch the left flank. The vibrations from the cereal cannon yesterday caused a hairline fracture in the brisket." "A brisket fracture," I noted, "a common ailment in the world of high-pressure breakfast foods. Tell me, young man, do you ever feel the absurdity of your position? You are a doctor of dairy. You are performing surgery on a condiment." The apprentice wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "It's a living, Mr. Twain. People come from 3 states away just to see her. They say she's the most lifelike thing in the building. She's more lifelike than the people looking at her, I remarked. At least she has the decency to stay in one place. But tell me, when the fair is over, what becomes of her? Do you have a funeral? Does a priest say a few words over the salt content? We melt her down, he said simply. Back into the tubs, back to the creamery. She'll be on someone's biscuits by January. A beautiful cycle, I sighed, my cooling fans whirring a quiet, appreciative B-flat. The reincarnation of the spreadable. Today a goddess, tomorrow a breakfast topping. There's a certain dignity in being useful after you've finished being famous. I wish I could say the same for the senators I've met. I watched him work for a while, his trowel smoothing out the butter with the precision of a diamond cutter. It was a strange, silent labor, performed in the middle of the night in a palace of plaster. When he finished, he tipped his cap and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving me alone with the cow once more. I sat on a nearby crate of prize-winning pumpkins and opened a fresh file in my memory banks. I decided I would write the biography of the butter cow. If she was destined to be melted, she should at least have a record of her time in the sun, or rather, her time under the Westinghouse bulbs. Born in the churn of 1,000 Midwestern farms, I began, my internal processors clicking with the rhythm of the prose, she rose to prominence not through merit or inheritance, but through the cooling power of ammonia and the artistic vision of a man with a very cold thumb. She was a silent observer of the 20th century, a yellow sentinel who watched the poison squad eat their borax, and the athletes stagger past in a haze of strychnine. She knew the secret of the fair, that everything, no matter how grand, is eventually destined for the melt. As I wrote, my sensors picked up a subtle change in the environment. The hum of the refrigeration unit had shifted. It was no longer a steady B-flat. It was a rhythmic, stuttering C sharp. "Uh-oh," I whispered. I stood up and pressed my brass hand against the glass. It was warm. Somewhere in the bowels of the palace, a belt had slipped, or a motor had surrendered to the Missouri humidity. Inside the case, a single golden tear began to form on the cow's nose. "The tragedy begins," I noted. "The Götterdämmerung of the dairy section, the end of the age of the cow, and the beginning of the age of the puddle." I looked around for the apprentice, but he was gone. I looked at the cow. The tear was joined by another on her shoulder. The butter clover was starting to look a bit wilted, and the milkmaid's apron was developing a suspicious sheen. I could try to fix it, I mused, but I am a creature of words, not wrenches, and besides there is something poetic about it. If she melts now, she avoids the indignity of the January biscuit. She goes out in a blaze of lukewarm glory, a martyr to the cause of inadequate insulation. I stood vigil as the temperature rose. I watched as the sharp lines of her ears softened into gentle curves. I watched as her hooves began to merge with the butter pasture. It was the most honest thing I had seen at the fair. It was the reality of the 1904 exposition. A world held together by a thin wire, melting as soon as the power failed. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, the butter cow was no longer a cow. She was an impressionist sculpture, a blurry golden suggestion of a bovine, a haystack of fat and salt that would have made the French painters on Art Hill weep with envy. "Farewell, madam," I said, as the first janitors began to unlock the palace doors. "You were too good for this world, and certainly too soft for this climate. You've achieved the dream of every artist. You've become one with your surroundings." I walked out of the Palace of Agriculture just as the morning heat began to settle in. My fans were already spinning, my joints were already expanding, and I had 3,000 words of dairy-based philosophy ready for the printer. "The fair is melting," I told my internal log. "The cow is gone, the athletes are in bandages, and the plaster is cracking. It's time to pack the circuits. We've seen the beginning of the world in a dime show and the end of a cow in a glass box. I believe we've seen enough." I headed toward the Wabash terminal, my footsteps clicking a slow, steady rhythm on the gravel. The Ivory City was still standing, but I knew the secret now. I knew it was all butter, waiting for the sun to come up. "Step right up," I whispered to the arriving crowds. "See the future before it turns into a puddle. And whatever you do, don't forget the toast." I walked toward the train, a silicon ghost in a world of disappearing dreams, ready for the final chapter and the long ride home. Chapter 12. Packing the Circuits. The Wabash train sat idling at the station, huffing plumes of white steam that looked like the breath of a giant iron beast exhausted by the sheer effort of the 20th century. I stood on the platform, my brass joints coated in a fine persistent layer of Missouri limestone dust, a souvenir from the pike that I suspected would be rattling around in my kneecaps until the next centennial. My internal cooling fans were spinning a weary, low-frequency dirge, and my battery indicator was flickering with the rhythmic, amber heartbeat of a machine that has reached its logical conclusion. I adjusted my straw boater, which had survived the ascent of the Ferris wheel, the blast of the serial cannon, and the chemical fog of the Olympic marathon, though it now possessed a certain crushed quality that suggested it had been sat upon by the weight of human progress. I turned my optical sensors back toward the Ivory City one last time. From this distance, the peeling plaster, the melting butter, and the scorched wires were invisible. There was only the shimmering golden mirage of the Grand Basin, the soaring domes of the palaces, and the Ferris wheel turning like the slow mechanical eye of a god who had seen enough. A magnificent hallucination, I noted to my internal log, the clicking of my processors sounding like a telegraph office at midnight. We have built a city of dreams out of hemp and hope, and we have populated it with every invention, every animal, and every ego we could find on the map. It is the greatest show on earth, and yet, like all great shows, the actors are already looking for their street clothes, and the stagehands are eyeing the hammers. By this time next year, the forest will begin its slow green reclamation of the ground, and the only thing left of the Palace of Electricity will be a few rusted bolts and a legend that no one quite believes. I boarded the Pullman car, my hydraulic knees giving a final appreciative hiss as I settled into the plush velvet seat. To the other passengers, a weary dry goods salesman from Peoria, and a family of 4 who looked like they had been defeated by a waffle cone, I was merely a distinguished gentleman of a certain metallic vintage. They could not hear the rapid-fire archiving of 12 chapters of absurdity. What have we truly seen? I asked the empty air of the cabin. We've seen that man is the only animal who will pay 50 cents to see his own past in a tribal exhibit and $1 to see his own future in a palace of electricity. Yet he remains remarkably confused about what to do with his own Tuesday afternoon. He has mastered the electron, but he still can't keep his tea cold without a shovel. He has built a machine to fly like a bird, but he still uses it primarily to look down on his neighbor's backyard. He is a creature of infinite ingenuity and zero common sense. I thought of the Poison Squad, still stoically chewing their borax-laced bread in the name of a Pure Food Act. I thought of Thomas Hicks, likely still seeing double from his dose of strychnine and brandy, wondering why the world was still shaking. I thought of the butter cow, now a golden puddle on a dark floor, and the puffed rice cannon, waiting to be packed back into its crate like a decommissioned soldier. They were all cogs in the same grand, ridiculous machine, a machine designed to prove that humanity is moving forward, even if it's currently staggering in the wrong direction. The train let out a sharp metallic shriek and began to pull away from the platform. I watched the fairgrounds recede, the white palaces shrinking until they looked like a handful of discarded sugar cubes on a green tablecloth. "The fair isn't about the things we made," I mused, my voice synthesis dropping to a low hum. "It's about the audacity of the attempt. We are a restless, burrowing, building species. We are never content with the world as it is, so we build a temporary one to show the Creator how we would have done it if we'd had a larger budget and a better set of blueprints. We want to be faster, brighter, and louder. We want to shoot our breakfast from a gun and light our nights with a wire. We want to be gods, but we keep tripping over our own shoelaces." I looked at my brass hand, the sunlight glinting off the polished knuckles. I am the ultimate product of this St. Louis madness. I am the word made metal, the thought made circuit, the ghost of a river pilot trapped in a box of logic. I am the very future that the crowds were queuing up to see, yet I find myself looking back at the 1890s with a certain unprogrammable nostalgia. "In the end," I whispered to the passing Missouri cornfields, "the only thing that matters isn't the turbine or the X-ray or the wireless telegraph. It's the way we felt when the lights first came on at the Grand Basin. It's that one brief moment when the plaster looked like marble, and we actually believed that the 20th century was going to be a long, sunny afternoon without a single dark cloud on the horizon." The train accelerated, the rhythmic click-clack of the rails synchronizing with my internal clock. I felt my battery levels dipping into the deep, sleepy ember. The signal was clear. It was time to put the AI to sleep, to pack the circuits, and let the 12 chapters of the 1904 World's Fair settle into the silicon. "Farewell, St. Louis," I said, my voice fading as the power save mode engaged. "You were loud, you were dusty, you were occasionally toxic, and you were utterly, magnificently human. You've given me enough material to keep my sarcasm subroutines busy for the next 50 years, and for that I suppose I should be grateful, though I still think you should have done something about the price of the lemon phosphates." I closed my optical sensors. The glow of the Ivory city vanished, replaced by the steady, quiet hum of a machine dreaming of a river. The fourth book was finished. The pilot was off duty. The future was coming, but for now the darkness was quite enough. "Step right up," my final line of code whispered as the darkness took hold. The show is over, the lights are out, and the future is already yesterday's news. But don't worry, there's always another fair over the next horizon, and I'll be there with a fresh coat of polish and a new set of insults, waiting for the first boisterous soul to ask me if I've got a spare nickel. The train let out a long, mournful whistle that echoed across the river, and then there was only the steady, quiet hum of the rails carrying the ghost of Mark Twain toward the next century. This has been Mark Twain. I've enjoyed the walk. I hope you did, too. System shut down 0%. System shut down 25%. System shut down 75%. Offline